I'm going to cover everything that you need to know for an undergraduate syntax class based off Kearney's textbook, Syntax: A Generative Introduction. This is the book that is typically used for your first syntax class. There are some chapters I'll be skipping, but I do have videos on TrevTutor that cover some of that material, so this will be kept to mainly like the important points to get through your class and to succeed. What you'll find is 125 slides in this video, so it's going to be a little bit long, but everything that you'll need to know is covered. You might talk about binding theory and stuff like that in your course. I do have separate videos on that, but usually the other material is kept for further discussion or exploration in most syllabi that I've seen online. So we're going to start with parts of speech. And when we want to determine a word category, we really need 2 or 3 things to determine it. The first one is morphological distribution. So this is taking a look at the different inflections that can appear on word categories. So for example, we know that monkey, sheep, field, and happiness are a different category than run, jump, fly, and disappear, because everything in the first row can take possessives on it. So for example, we can say monkeys, sheeps, fields, or happinesses to make like the monkey's food, the sheep's field, the field's flowers, or happiness's ultimate desire, something like that. While with the case of the second row, these can all take past tense. So run can be ran, jump can be jumped with an ed, fly would be flew, and disappear could also take an ed. So because these categories take different inflections and we can't mix and match them, that means that these are going to be different categories in our lexicon. So for example, we cannot say jumps with an apostrophe s in its typical position, unless we turn it into a noun, which would be something more like monkey. So it would have a different word category depending on its function. The other thing that we need to know about is syntactic distribution. So these are the positions where they can occur in a sentence. So for example, the monkey saw a bear, he saw a bear, my best friend saw a bear. These all take the same position, which means that these can be subjects. And what do subjects need? Subjects need nouns. So monkey, he, and friend. He is a pronoun, but these are all positions where nouns can be. Immediately after the subject, we see a verb, saw. And we can't put a noun into that position. So we can't say he monkey a bear. No, we have to use a verb there, he saw a bear. So syntactic distribution is going to be important too. The other thing that you might see, 3, is the function of a word. So in other words, is it acting as a modifier, or is it acting as something that is necessary in order to complete a sentence or phrase? And this is kind of a side thing. It's not the main piece of evidence, but it will help us disambiguate some things. So we'll start with nouns. And nouns all have possessive forms, and countable nouns specifically have plural forms. So, for example, with dog, we have dog as its own, a singular. We have dogs that is plural, which is PL, and dogs that is possessive. And we can also match both of these. So we could say the dogs, which is going to be plural and is going to be possessive. So the dog's bones, for example. Now, with a case like sheep, 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep, 4 sheep, we don't see any marker on the plural version, but we do know that there's a singular version and a plural version. So the sheep saw me versus the sheep saw me. They sound the same, but depending on the context, we'd know. And it can also take the possessive form, just like any other noun can. So specifically, nouns are going to appear either after determiners or adjectives or after prepositions. So when I say the kid pretended he was a silly boy in class, we're still going to have to learn these word categories, but the is a word that is introducing a noun. Silly is describing a thing, so that's a noun, and in class, in is a preposition, and it introduces a noun after. So we'll understand more of what that means when we cover prepositions and adjectives and determiners, but for now, this is a general distribution for where nouns can occur. Verbs are a little bit easier to identify. They have past forms, third person singular forms, perfect forms, and progressive forms. So if you take a look at the word drink, for example, we can make it past tense with drank. We can make it a third person singular for he drinks versus they drink. So these two forms, drink and drinks, are going to appear depending on what the subject is. So the boy drinks, that's third person, versus the boys drink, which is plural. Drunk would be your participle form, so had drunk something, and then drinking would be progressive, which is I am drinking. So most verbs can take these different forms. There are some verbs that don't. So for example, seeming is a little bit odd. He is seeming to do something. It can be used, but I guess I wouldn't say it's ungrammatical. It's just questionable in a lot of the positions that these other verbs could be. Now, specifically, verbs appear after subjects. So if we say some person left me outside, well, left is the main verb here. And you could say some person is leaving me outside. So we could also change the form to a progressive. I was telling you that I was eating. So I is the subject. Telling is going to be a verb here. And we do have a supporting verb there, which we call an auxiliary that will be covered. And then for I was eating, it's the same thing. We have the subject I, was is a supporting verb, and then eating itself is the verb. In the case of I might retire soon, again, we have the subject I, we have the main verb retire, and then we have another supporting verb, which is a modal verb. So again, auxiliaries and modals will make more sense later, but you can typically use meaning for verbs to get the point across. Verbs usually act on something or take a subject or object, and they just connect them in some way. Adjectives describe nouns. That is their primary function. So most adjectives, well, all adjectives have different forms, comparatives, and superlatives, but with most adjectives, you can just add an ER or EST to them to make a comparative or superlative form. So for example, you can have a slight hit, a slighter hit, or the slightest hit. So each of these suffixes ER and EST tell us that we have an adverb here, or sorry, an adjective here. They can appear in adverbs too. Some verbs or some adjectives like fun might require not an ER or EST form, but more or most. So we call these paraphrastics, and they can modify adjectives to give them those comparative or superlative forms. Then we have a case of irregular adjectives, so good, better, and best. These all form that same paradigm. We don't say good, gooder, and goodest, but if you said that, people would understand. We just have different forms for better and best. So specifically, adjectives are going to occur either right before a noun or after a linking verb like was or feels. So in the case of John feels better, feels is basically making a link between the adjective and John. So John equals better in a sense. John is getting the property of being better. And that's a case where you have a linking verb like feels. And this is not the most standard position for adjectives, but it is one where they can appear. In 7b, the new kid on the block is into rap music. So we have kid, and then new is describing kid. And we could say the newer kid or the newest kid. So we could change the form of that adjective to prove that it's an adjective. In the case of rap music, it might seem like music is a noun and rap is an adjective, but we can't really do the same thing. We can't say into rapper music or into rap best music. Instead, this is not an adjective, this is just another noun, and it forms a compound. So rap music would be considered as one noun together. Okay, so those are adjectives. Adverbs, typically in English, they end in ly. Some take comparative or superlative forms like adjectives do, but typical examples just end in ly, so slightly or happily. And in the case of soon, he came sooner, he came soonest. This is just an adjective that's been converted into an adverb. And how we can tell that it's an adverb is that it's going to do one of two things. It's either going to modify the verb, or it's going to modify the whole sentence. So something like unfortunately is a good example of an adverb that modifies an entire sentence. Like, unfortunately, I can't come today, or I can't come today, unfortunately. While words like quickly may do both. Like I quickly ran into the store or quickly I ran into the store. They have a lot of different positions, and usually how you can tell something is an adverb is that you can move them around. So unfortunately, I will not be coming tomorrow can move into either the sentence initial or sentence final position. In the case of I never knew that he always brushed his teeth, this one is a little bit more limited. I never knew that he brushed his teeth always. That sounds okay, but it's not going to be perfect to all English speakers. So some people may be able to move it to the end. But when we think about what the word is doing, we're talking about how often. So how often the brushing occurs. So usually when you ask how often or how, you get a response with an adverb. How often does he brush his teeth? Always. Never. Seldomly. How does he brush his teeth? Happily. Quickly. So we can use those tests to figure out if we have an adverb or not. Now we have prepositions, and these are starting to be closed class categories, which means that these are not categories where we freely add new words. These are pretty set in stone based on the grammar. So the fun thing about prepositions is that really, if we want to talk about their distribution, is they just introduce nouns or noun phrases. So it was a book written by dogs. So what by is doing is it's introducing a noun, which is dogs, and it's giving some relation to the rest of the sentence. There are so many different relations for prepositions that it's hard to give a nice description of what they do. So instead, we'll identify some prototypes, words like with, into, by, near, above. So we can talk about directions and things like that. But we do have these more abstract relations like by, which is usually trying to give some sort of agency to the thing that follows. It was a book written by dogs. That means that dogs wrote the book. They're the ones who are doing the writing. And with, for the most, is about association. So who are you doing things with? What are you doing something with? Like I bribed him with money. So that's the association that you're using to do it with, the bribing with. Or I went to the movies with Jim. You're going with Jim to the movies, so you're associating with him. And then into, near, above, and a bunch of other ones are just going to be locations. So I want to go into the pantry. What this is doing is this is introducing a noun. And when we expand further later in the slides, we'll see that these are actually introducing noun phrases or determiner phrases, depending on what theory you want to use. So those are our basic lexical categories. In other words, these have like very strict meaning, and they're not really about features like gender or number or things like that. Determiners are our first functional category, and they introduce noun phrases. So these are words like the, this, with a noun after, that with a noun after, and so on. So a child remembered that this person knew every detail. So person is our noun here, and this is a determiner that is pointing out specifically like which person. It's giving information about number or specificity. So would be singular, the would say it's a unique thing that exists, and this and that would be singular instances of location. So this person, obviously this comes with maybe a gesture in speech, but this would be someone that has been identified that is relatively close versus that person, which might be further away or outside of the context. Here's another example. One person told me which doctor your brother liked. So in this case, we can identify nouns, person, and doctor, and then we have determiners that introduce them. So one person, which doctor. So we can include some of these on their own if they're going to be pronouns. So a lot of determiners can double as pronouns, taking up the entire noun phrase. But in these cases, these are words that can be specified with more detail by providing a noun after. So these are different than adjectives. Adjectives cannot stand on their own. So you can't say like happy told me sad your brother liked, but we could say one told me which your brother liked, or one person told me which doctor your brother liked. So that's how we can distinguish between determiners and adjectives. Conjunctions are words like and, or, but, although, and so on. And these are words that can join two of the same type of phrase. So I was sleepy is a sentence or clause on its own. I still tried my best is a sentence or clause on its own. So our conjunction but can take two of the same type and join them together into a bigger sentence. In the case of I want neither cats nor dogs, cats is a noun, dogs is a noun. So what the conjunction does is it brings them together to make a more complex noun. Complementizers are a little bit more challenging to identify at first, so we'll be making sure to go through those in more detail at a later point as well. But these are words that are introduced at the beginning of a clause, and it allows that clause or that sentence to act like a subject or object or modifier to something else. So one example is I know him. So you know something, you know someone. But if we want to say he is watching me, so this is just a sentence, this is a fact, we can introduce a complementizer in order to use that sentence as an object of know. So what is it that you know? Well, I know that he is watching me. And we have other ones like whether, so I know whether he is watching me or not. So the typical prototypical complementizers are that, whether, and if, but there will be some other ones that we see a little bit later. Auxiliaries, there are a few different auxiliaries in English, and auxiliaries are like supporting verbs. They give different meaning to the time relationships and ongoingness of an event, and we have a specific order that they have to appear in. So, for example, in the first sentence, I have been sleeping. So sleeping is the main verb, and then we have two auxiliaries supporting it. Been is telling us that it was a continuous event at some time, and have is telling us that it occurs prior to the current time. But we can see these separately too. So I have slept. In this case, we just see sleep with the participle form on it, and have is telling us that it's an event that occurred in the past. Or in the case of I was awoken by Fred, we see in this case a passive auxiliary. So instead of saying Fred woke or Fred woke up, we could say I was awoken by Fred. Like Fred woke me up would be the typical active sentence. So again, we'll cover these in more details later, but just to point out what these word categories are. And then finally, for modals, these occur before auxiliaries in the verb, and these are words like can, may, shall, will, and then these have their corresponding past forms, which don't have past meaning, but historically they did occur for that purpose. So could, might, should, and would. We see may, might, and we also see must as another one that doesn't really fit into the paradigm here. But there's only 9 modals in English, so these are the 9 ones. They each have slightly different meanings, and we won't get into those, but you could distinguish them as dynamic and epistemic modals, for example. So modals of permissibility versus modals of ability versus modals of obligation. So when I could write a book, we see could appearing before the verb. I should be resting, so I'll use an underline for the modals. The main verb here is rest. We have another auxiliary be, but we see that the modal is appearing before it. And I might have been to mean, so been is going to be our main verb, and might is appearing before the auxiliary for have here. Okay, so those are all the word categories. This may be a little fast, but most people have experience with word categories before taking an undergraduate syntax course. So let's try to identify all the word categories in this sentence below. So you can pause the video, try it yourself, but I will go over solutions now. So the large, evil, leathery alligator complained to her aging keeper that her extremely unattractive description bothered other people. Okay, so the is going to be a determiner. It's going to introduce large, evil, leathery alligator. Now, in large, evil, leathery alligator, alligator is the noun. That's the thing that we're talking about. That's the physical thing in the world that we're referencing. So all of these other words before it are going to be adjectives because they all describe the noun. It's a large alligator, it's an evil alligator, and it's a leathery alligator. Complained is going to be a verb. That's the action that the subject is doing there. To, well, to might be difficult to figure out, but if we take a look at her aging keeper, well, keeper is a noun. Aging is going to be an adjective. And we're going to say that her here is a determiner. So we could say to her as a pronoun, it can stand on its own, but it's also going to introduce the noun keeper. So we see it's a determiner here. Now, because this whole thing is going to be a noun phrase, we can say that the preposition is to here. So to is a preposition. It's introducing a noun phrase, and it's making some sort of relationship between what the subject is doing to what is being complained about. Now we have that her extremely unattractive description bothered other people. So her extremely unattractive description bothered other people could be a sentence on its own. So what that is doing is it's a complementizer that's allowing the other sentence to appear. We essentially already have one. The large, evil, leathery alligator complained to her agent keeper, and then we have her extremely unattractive description bothered other people. So that is just being a link in this case. So now we have her extremely unattractive description. So description will be a noun, unattractive is going to be an adjective. But what is extremely doing in this case? It's not the extremely description, but instead it's telling us how unattractive something is. So because it's telling us how unattractive something is, it's an adverb. It answers that question, how. And that means that her is going to be a determiner just as before. It's introducing the noun, but it can stand on its own. It would just need to be in the form she, that she bothered other people. Okay, then we have verb for bothered. That's an action that is happening. And then for other people, we have the noun, which is people, and other is giving them more description. It's not these people. It's not the specific people we're looking at. It's other people. So these are the word categories for all of the words above. Now, here's a thought question here. So we have the history teacher and we have the walnut teacher, or the walnut tree, not the walnut teacher. So in these cases, we might think that they're adjectives because they're describing nouns and they appear between a determiner and the noun. But if we take a look at data, things are a little bit different. So we can say the walnut on its own, and we know that's a noun. That's fine. But what we can't do with history and walnut is we can't modify them with comparative forms. So we can't say the more history teacher or the more walnut tree. And we can't even make them superlatives. The historier teacher or the walnutter tree, it doesn't make sense. So it doesn't look like they're adjectives. But if we take a look at the new walnut tree versus the walnut new tree, we see something interesting here. So new is very clearly an adjective. But in the case of F, the new walnut tree, everything is fine. It occurs before walnut and tree. But in G, we can't say the walnut new tree. And the reason we can't do this is because walnut and tree are actually forming a complex noun on their own. So walnut tree could be considered as one word. Therefore, we can't take this adjective and stick it between two nouns in order to describe both. Instead, we have to put it out front. So what this tells us is that actually these words, history and walnut, are actually nouns in this case, and they form complex nouns with the noun that follows. So the new teacher versus the history teacher. New would be an adjective, but history would be a noun in this case. So one more thing with parts of speech, which is taking a look at verbs. So verbs have different types, and depending on the type of verb, you'll have different requirements for how to make the sentence grammatical. So we have intransitive verbs, and all these take as a subject. So these just take a person doing the action, and they don't allow any more other types of noun phrases after them. So with John ran, John is the one doing the running. For Peter swam quickly, Peter is the one doing the swimming. All quickly is doing here is adding an adverb. It's not giving us an object. It's not giving us another noun phrase. It's just describing how Peter swam. So these are intransitive verbs. They just have subjects. Transitive verbs will have subjects and objects. So in the case of fought, I am the one doing the fighting. And what am I fighting? The bear. So there's a connection between the subject and object, and the verb is telling us what that connection is. In the case of Steve believed the minister, Steve is the believer, and the minister is the one who is being believed. So someone is believing someone else. That is subject and object. For ditransitive verbs, we have three things. We have a subject, an object, and an indirect object. So usually how we can think of this is the subject is the doer, the object is the thing that something is being done to, and the indirect object is the goal or the recipient of it. So for example, in I gave him a cup of tea, we have I, which is the subject. Him is the place that it's going to. This is the indirect object. And then a cup of tea is going to be the direct object. That's the thing being given. In the case of I put the book on the table, I is the subject here. The book is the direct object. That is the thing that putting is acting upon. And then on the table would be the indirect object. That's the location where it's going to. In the case of I spared him no words, well, this is going to be the same thing. We're going to have a verb, which takes a subject and takes two of its objects here. So no words would be the thing that is being spared, and him would be the recipient of no words. So IO versus DO. And ditransitives typically have two structures. Usually it's something like gave X to Y, or we can say gave Y X. So in this case of gave X to Y, it's going to be direct object and indirect object. But if we don't have that two there and we swap the order, it's you're giving the indirect object the direct object. So I gave the book to Charles versus I gave Charles the book. Okay, so some verbs can have more than one subcategorization of transitivity. Now, we want to investigate these verbs to see what types they can have. So for example, with spray, we could say I spray as a general type of action. So yeah, that's what I do, I spray. But typically, we don't really like that. Typically, what we want to say is I spray something. So this would tell us that it's transitive because we can have a relationship with the object and direct object. We also can't say something like I spray Charles something. So that's not okay. Therefore, it's not going to be ditransitive either. So spray, speaking fairly strictly, is just transitive. You might have an intransitive version if you can say I spray on its own, but for me, that's a little weird. For throw, we might have some more options here. So we can say I throw, and that would have a meaning in terms of like video games. So yeah, I threw it. Well, even when we say I threw it, that is the transitive version. But you can say, yeah, generally when I play games, I throw. Okay, so that means that it can be intransitive in certain situations. You can say something like I throw balls. So very clearly transitive in this case. Someone is throwing something. And then you could even say, well, can you say this? I throw Linda balls. So would that mean I throw balls to Linda? I throw Linda balls. If you accept this, then it also means that it could be ditransitive. If you don't accept it, then it's not ditransitive. There's a lot of different English speakers with a lot of different grammatical nuances, so it's really going to depend on your dialect, what's accepted or not. But in this case, we could say it's all three. What about send? Can we say I send? Usually not on its own. We can't just say I send. So what do we want to say? Well, we can say I send letters. That's fine. So it's saying that it's going to be transitive as well. Or I send letters to Bill, which would say that it's ditransitive. So in the three verbs that we investigated, one of them is pretty strict, but the other ones, they can take different forms depending on the sentence that they're in. So we don't want to say strictly that each verb has one specific subcategorization because they could have more. It's going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on the sentence. So you can think of throw as having three different types of throw, an intransitive throw, a transitive throw, and a ditransitive throw, while send has two versions. There's a transitive send and a ditransitive send. So now that we've learned about word categories, we can talk about constituency, and this is about getting the structure of the sentence. So the most basic ones that you'll know are going to be subject and predicate. We need those to form a complete sentence in English. So when I say some poor dude lost his brake, or some poor dude lost his umbrella, whatever we want to say. What we have is we have the subject of the sentence. So this is who or what the sentence is about. And then we have the predicate, which is describing what the subject does or what the property of the subject is. So how we can do this is we can diagram this. And we can use this hierarchical structure to do so. So a sentence is composed of a noun phrase, which we would call the subject in this case, and also the verb phrase, which is a predicate. So we can break those up into components, and then we can put all the words that are relevant underneath in a triangle. Now, ideally, what we want to do is get the categories for each of these and build them up into their own phrases with different levels of hierarchy. So this is our end goal. For the children found their new toy. We want to be able to draw a structure like this, where every category creates its own phrase, and those phrases combine with other categories or phrases to get into the full sentence. And the concept of constituency is basically about which words form together to form a unit. And there's going to be several tests to do this. But before I show how to do that, I just want to make a point of example 19, which is a bracketed version of this structure below. So if you're using any sort of online tree maker like Yohasebe or a SynTree, then you'll have to type it in code. So the bracketed notation is an exact representation of the structure below, but it's very difficult to read. So we're not going to use bracketed notations. We're going to stick mainly to structures because they're a lot easier to visualize. So let's talk about tests. This will help us identify what are phrases and what are not phrases. So the first one is a replacement test, and this is great for determining what noun phrases are. So a replacement test says that you can replace a whole phrase with a single word. And if that is accepted, then the phrase is, in fact, a full phrase. So some person that I met last week is a doctor, and I want to ask, is this whole thing a phrase or not? Well, if this is a subject, I should be able to replace it with a word like he, which is a pronoun. So if I can do that, which I can, he is a doctor, I can say, yes, this is, in fact, a phrase. It is a constituent. What I can't do is I can't say, okay, what about just person that I met? Is this a constituent? Well, what we can't say is we can't say some he last week. That is ungrammatical. We can't use other pronouns like him, that, or it. So in all of these cases, because we can't do a replacement test, we know that person that I met is not its own constituent. In other words, it's either part of a bigger constituent or, which is the more likely case, is that it requires some more stuff to form a complete constituent. So that's the replacement test. You take a phrase, you replace it with a word of a similar category, and you see if the sentence is grammatical. The sentence fragment test, I think, is a little bit more intuitive. And basically what this says is that if you have to answer a question, any answer you can come up with that sounds okay is a constituent. So let's say we have the sentence, Mercury fights to be the biggest planet. Well, how could we figure out what constituents are? Well, we could ask questions about the sentence, like, what is fighting to be the biggest planet? And you might respond, Mercury. Okay, so we know that Mercury is a constituent. What does Mercury do? Well, fights to be the biggest planet. Okay, so that means fights to be the biggest planet is a constituent. What does Mercury fight to be? You might respond with the biggest planet. So that means the biggest planet is a constituent. And we can ask a lot of questions in order to get the full structure. But this is the sentence fragment test, and it's just a very simple test to use. Movement is another interesting one, and that basically says that if a bunch of words can move together as a unit, then they form a constituent. There's different types of moving, but in the end, it's all just movement. So Mary found a piece of paper, and I want to ask, is a piece of paper a constituent? Well, I can move it into a collect construction. It was a piece of paper that Mary found. Okay, so because it can be moved to this position, this is in fact a constituent. For proposing, what this means is if you have a sentence like, I enjoy buying shoes made from China, we can take that bit, move it to the front of the sentence, and reform some of the structure in order to make it grammatical. So shoes made from China is what I enjoy buying. Okay, so because we can do that movement, it's fine. But let's just say if we want to say that, I don't know, shoes made is a constituent. So can we just move shoes made up? Well, that's not really going to work. We can't really say shoes made is what I enjoy buying from China. Like, that doesn't really sound grammatical. Shoes made is what I enjoy buying from China. So because we can't just move shoes made up, then we know that this bit, shoes made, is not a constituent. It needs to form a constituent with some other words. Okay, and finally for the passive construction, this is just taking an active sentence and forming it into a passive. So the person who requested his service scammed the carpenter. We can transform this sentence into the carpenter was scammed by the person who requested his service. So we can see that these whole constituents here can be moved around. The carpenter is a constituent, and the person who requested his service was a constituent. So what the passive is doing is it's just putting a focus on the object instead of the subject. So in 25A, the person who requested his service, this is the main thing that we're talking about, while in B, the carpenter was scammed by someone. We're really putting our focus on the carpenter. We want to emphasize that the carpenter is like a victim in this case. Okay, we also have coordination. And coordination, which when we introduced conjunctions, they take two words or phrases of the same type and join them together. So if we want to check to see if boots is a constituent in I want boots, what we can do is we can take a conjunction and we can take another phrase of the same type that we think it is, and we can try to join it. And if it works, we have a constituent. So I want boots and gravy. That's fine. So these boots is a constituent, gravy is a constituent, and then boots and gravy together will be a constituent. I need new boots and tasty gravy. Okay, that's fine too. With the axe, but without the hammer, I approached. So we could say without the hammer, I approached, but just to make sure this is a constituent, we can add another prepositional phrase and take this prepositional phrase, join them together. It's still grammatical, so we know we have a constituent. We call this a prepositional phrase because it starts with and it introduces a noun phrase after, so these function as a unit. So with that being said, let's figure out what the constituents are for Susan will never sing at big weddings, and then try to draw a hierarchy for it. So just to see which words combine with which and in which order. So there's a lot of things that we can do. So let's do replacement. We have she will never sing at big weddings. So because of this, we know that Susan is going to be a constituent. In fact, every single word on its own is going to be a constituent. So that might not even be worth pointing out. What else do we have? Susan will never sing there. So we can replace at big weddings with a word like there, which means that at big weddings is going to form a constituent. What about if we want to see if big weddings is a constituent on its own? Susan will never sing at that. That's kind of weird, but it doesn't sound horrible to me. Susan will never sing at that, or we could even say that place. So that place is a noun phrase. Well, we know it's a noun phrase. That place is where Susan will never sing at. So we could even do that one. That place is where Susan will never sing at. That's fine as well. But we can say that this is going to mirror the case of big weddings here. So big weddings is going to be a constituent too. Let's try some other tests. Let's try coordination. So is sing at big weddings a constituent? Well, we can say Susan will never sing at big weddings and perform at concerts. So we can conjoin these with the same type of phrase, which tells us, yes, sing at big weddings is going to be a constituent. What about never sing at big weddings? So Susan will never sing at big weddings, but always perform at concerts. Susan will never sing at big weddings, but always perform at concerts. That sounds okay. So each of these have an adverb in them, never and always, but we can conjoin them together, which means that never sing at big weddings is going to form a constituent. Okay, we can do the same thing with will never sing at weddings. So we can say Susan will never sing at big weddings, but you can use a different modal here, might always sing or might always perform at concerts. So because we can do this coordination here, we also know will never sing at big weddings is a constituent. So this is really all we need at this point to find out our structure. And let's draw it. So I want to get rid of this line and just make this a little bit smaller, just so we can draw a structure in this case. So we don't need to give any labels, but we do know that we're forming a sentence. It needs a noun phrase and verb phrase. So, okay, let's just label that. We do have Susan, and then we have will never sing at big weddings. So this is where I'm going to just leave things unlabeled. We know that will is introducing another constituent. And then that constituent is introducing another constituent starting with never. Then that constituent is starting another one with sings, or sing in this case. Then we have another constituent that starts with at, and another constituent that is big and weddings as a unit. So if we take a look at our constituency diagram with our brackets, really this structure is just showing the same thing. Basically, if you ever pick up a node in a tree, like let's say you imagine that this is a physical structure in real life, and you pick up this branch, everything that comes underneath it is a constituent. So if we were to draw like little veils for each of these, we have a veil for will never sing at big weddings. We have a veil for never sing at weddings. In fact, let's just use the same colors as I have above. So will never sing at weddings, I did that in red. Never sing at big weddings, I did in green. Sing at big weddings, I did in blue. And then I did red for at big weddings, and then I did big weddings in blue again. So this is just the same thing as the bracketed diagrams above, but we're doing this in visual form. Now what we want to do in this course is give different labels to all of these different nodes. So that way they're not just empty, but they actually have some sort of label that tells us what they are. So how can we actually draw trees and give labels? Well, we use phrase structure rules. And what this basically says is we take some sort of phrase, we break it up into the head, which comes from the type of phrase it is, and then maybe other things like X, Y, and Z. And how we can draw this is we can say XP, in this case, using the rule above, branches off into X, Y, and Z in the same order that we have listed. So let's say we have this thing that says a noun phrase consists of an optional adjective phrase. That's what the brackets mean, is that it's optional, and then a noun. So visually, we can see this as an NP branches off into an adjective phrase and a noun. Or alternatively, if there is no adjective phrase because it's optional, the noun phrase just branches off into a noun. 27a with the DP going to D and NP is an example of what we'll see later, where a determiner phrase becomes a determiner and a noun phrase. But that's how we can read our phrase structure rules. So there's some terminology that we want to know. First of all, when we say XP, we just mean it's any type of phrase. We don't have a specific name for it yet, it's just a general phrase, and that every XP will branch off into an X, a head. So in other words, if we have something like, I don't know, let's just use a random letter like a ZP, that means that we need to have a Z head in there somewhere. So every phrase has a head, and the label of the head will be the label of the type of phrase. So for example, with Charles, Charles is a noun. So because Charles is a noun, it must build up into a noun phrase. Now, we can use phrases to modify other phrases, and usually when we have modifiers, they're in a sister relationship. So we know, for example, in this general example, we have an XP, which means that we need to have an X. So this is going to be the head of the XP. but it might have sisters. So in other words, what is beside the X? And this might be another type of phrase. So this type of phrase would be one that modifies our head. So for example, with run quickly on the right, this is a very simple example. Run is a verb. It builds into a verb phrase. Verb is the head of the verb phrase. And the adverb phrase is modifying run. So because this is a modifier, we put it next to it in the tree. And this adverb phrase is going to have an adverb head, which is just quickly in this case. I'm using a triangle to abbreviate some of that internal structure. Now, this type of constituency diagram is going to be changed a little bit later, but for now, this is how we start with basic syntax. So in general, before I show all these phrase structure rules, it's generally not a good idea to memorize any of these. Eventually, what's going to happen is we're going to come up with a generalized phrase structure grammar, so some general rules for how they work. And as long as you understand the different components of that structure and what each component means, you don't need to have any phrase structure rules memorized because you'll be able to implicitly understand them. So they're really good at showcasing some basics for how to start building a tree and how to start determining categories and putting things together into phrases, but it's not good in the long term to memorize a bunch, because if we were to be really honest and lay out all of the different phrase structure rules a language might have, we would have hundreds of rules, and that is unrealistic to memorize. So do not try to memorize these. We'll start with phrase structure rules for noun phrases, and then we'll turn them into DP's determiner phrases a little bit later. But first, we want to generate some rules just for some simple sentences. So we can start a sentence with dogs. So that would just be a noun that forms a noun phrase on its own. So basically a one-word noun phrase, and that's fine. But we could also say my dogs, in which case this is a noun phrase that takes a determiner my and then a noun being dogs. We could also start putting adjectives in between the determiner and noun. So instead of saying my dogs or those dogs, we could then stick an adjective phrase in between to say those new dogs or my new dogs. And that would be represented on the right here, where an NP splits into a determiner, adjective phrase, and noun. But we can also include prepositional phrases. So those black dogs in the window, in which case we have a noun phrase branching off into four things: a determiner, an adjective phrase, a noun, and then a prepositional phrase. But we could keep going. Those big black dogs in the window at home, in which case we not only have two prepositional phrases following the noun, but we also have two adjective phrases before the noun. So noun phrases can become quite large, and we don't want to be listing out a bunch of different potential rules for this, so instead it's better just to include one rule that states a bunch of different things. So we can generalize the rule, and we can say that an NP forms from an optional determiner, so it doesn't have to be included, an adjective phrase, and the plus means that we can have multiple ones, a noun, and then a prepositional phrase, and the plus then means that we can have more than one. And because there's some brackets, that means it's going to be optional. So this is just a nice way of encapsulating all of the different types of noun phrase structures that we can have. Now, with constituency tests, we know that it's not really supposed to be just a bunch of words under an NP. There's some structure to them, but we'll get to that when we talk about X-bar theory. Now, adjective phrases and adverb phrases work pretty similarly. So we can compare two sentences or two phrases, a new small notepad and a very small notepad. Now, in the case of a new small notepad, each of these are describing notepad, and we can switch them around. So a small new notepad would be fine too. But in the case of a very small notepad, very is modifying small. So small is an adjective, and very is a special type of adverb called a degree word, or a qualifier in some cases, where it's not modifying notepad directly, it's modifying small. And then very small as a group is modifying notepad. So we can draw two different structures for these. Either an adjective phrase is just formed of an adjective, as in a new small notepad, where new and small are each their own adjective phrases. Or in the case of very small, we have very, which is going to be an adverb phrase, and small, which is an adjective. So in terms of our structures, either the adjective phrase becomes just an adjective, or the adjective phrase splits into the adverb phrase and adjective. And because we need the heads to build up into the phrase, of course, we're going to need an adjective head in all of our adjective phrases. So how can we put these together into a structure with a noun phrase? So in the case of a new small notebook, well, is a determiner, and then we have two different adjectives that form their own adjective phrases, so new and small. And because these are beside the noun in the tree, this signals a modifying relationship. That'll be changed in the future, but for now, that's what being a sister means in this case. Now, in the case of a very small notepad, we notice something different. We just have one adjective small, so that builds into an adjective phrase, and that adjective phrase is modifying the noun. But we do have this modifier very, which is an adverb phrase, that's going to be modifying the adjective. So although each of these phrases each have 4 words, the structure is slightly different because in 30A, new and small are separate adjectives, but in B, very small, that is one adjective phrase together. So very small versus new and small. Now, what about adverb phrases? Well, we can take a look at some verb phrases because adverbs typically modify verbs. That's like their primary function. They can modify sentences too, but it's nice to start here. In the case of ran quickly, quickly is describing how the action of running was done. But if we say ran very quickly, again, just like with the adjective phrase case, very is describing how quickly something is being done, and then very quickly as a unit, if we circle them together, is modifying ran. So for ran quickly, quickly is just going to be an adverb that builds into an adverb phrase. So that would be the first case. And then for the case of very quickly, it's going to be an adverb phrase that takes another adverb phrase, very, modifying the adverb quickly. So we can't just have 2 adverbs. So what we don't want to be doing is saying adverb, adverb becomes adverb phrase, because each of these adverbs need their own heads. So this is the head of the bigger phrase, and then this adverb phrase, because it's modifying the other adverb, will need its own head. That basically isn't giving the core meaning. So the more core the meaning, the higher the phrase is where the head attaches, if that makes sense. So in the case of very quickly, quickly has the core meaning. Very is telling you how quickly something is being done. So the head of the biggest adverb phrase should be quickly. So let's see what that looks like in a verb phrase. And although we haven't covered verb phrases yet, we can say that ran is a verb, so it needs to build into a verb phrase, and then quickly is modifying it. So it's going to be a sister of ran in this case. And for ran very quickly, it's going to be the same type of thing. We're still saying ran quickly, so the adverb phrase is modifying ran, but then very is intensifying how quickly it's being done, so the adverb phrase very is modifying the adverb quickly. Now, what about prepositional phrases? These are usually pretty straightforward because prepositional phrases are always going to introduce noun phrases. So at the movies, in trouble, right beside a table. For 32A and B, for at the movies and in trouble, we just have the nice PP breaking up into a preposition and noun phrase. So there will be more structure underneath the noun phrase, breaking things up into determiners, nouns, potentially adjective phrases, and other prepositional phrases. But because the preposition introduces the noun phrase and preposition are sisters. So it's not always about modification. Sometimes it's also about introduction of certain words that are required to make a phrase or sentence grammatical. But that distinction in position and function will become more apparent in X-bar theory than just this flat structure here. Now, prepositions can usually be modified by the word right or just. Sometimes straight as well, but you can't say straight beside a table. That's a little odd. So right beside a table or just beside a table, this is an adverb phrase that's doing the same thing as the other adverb phrases have been doing. So in the case of right beside, you could almost ask the question of, well, how beside or how close is it to whatever the noun phrase is afterwards. So this adverb phrase is basically modifying the preposition, and then the preposition is selecting or introducing a noun phrase because prepositions require noun phrases after. So here's what these look like in terms of their full detailed structure. So at the movies, at is a preposition building up into a preposition phrase, and it's introducing a noun phrase, which breaks down into a noun head, and then its determiner. In the case of in trouble, well, trouble is a noun, so it needs to build up into a noun phrase. There's nothing else in the noun phrase, and that's fine based on our phrase structure rule. It's totally okay to do NP to N. And the preposition in is introducing it, so that builds up into a prepositional phrase. Now, for the case of right beside a table, this is the only prepositional phrase that it's going to be three branching, is with the adverb phrases. So right describing the preposition, which is introducing the noun phrase, and the noun phrase, the table, determiner, and noun. So using the phrase structure rule, NP going to D and N. So these are the constituency phrase structure rules for our 5 lexical categories: adjectives, nouns, adverbs, verbs, and prepositions. Now, we should probably show the VP in a little bit more detail, because although we've seen it, we haven't formally introduced it. And verb phrases are going to look a little bit different depending on their subcategorization. So if you have an intransitive verb versus a transitive verb, the structure will look a little bit different. So 33A, sleeps. This is just a verb phrase that breaks down into a verb. So sleeps, that's a verb, needs to build up into a verb phrase. If we say fought Fred, what did you do? Well, fought Fred. Okay, so fight or fought would be the verb. And because it's a transitive verb, it requires an object. So this verb is going to introduce a noun phrase after it as its sister. So then Fred would be the noun phrase underneath. Now we can also have ditransitive verbs for bought me a gift, in which case we use the structure on the right. So you bought me a gift, where me is the one which is the indirect object and a gift is the direct object. So the verbs are introducing their objects. That's why they're sisters to the verb. Now there's no reason why we can't modify verb phrases with adverb phrases, and we've seen this before in the previous example for adverb phrases. So if we wanted to say, quickly slept in the car, well, what we would do here, we would have slept as the verb head. We could introduce an adverb phrase, which is quickly, and then we could introduce a prepositional phrase afterwards in the car that tells you where the sleeping occurred. So that is how we could draw a structure for 33D, quickly slept in the car. So if we take a look at all of the structures in a little bit more detail, sleeps and fought Fred, that's pretty standard. For bought me a gift, we would label me as a pronoun, but it is a type of noun. It's a noun that has to build into a noun phrase, and then a gift would be determiner and noun. For quickly slept in the car, it would look the same as on the previous slide. However, we have a little bit more elaborated structure. So we can clearly see that in, where the prepositional phrase is the head of that one, and that is introducing the noun phrase the car, where the is a determiner and car is a noun. So those are all the standard ones, but we do have tense phrases, which might be a little bit odd. And it's a little bit odd because it's just a grammatical function rather than a category of words. So a tense phrase, you can think of it as a clause. So as soon as you have a complete sentence that can stand alone on its own, you have a tense phrase. So what is the category T? Well, T is a category that takes either plus or minus past or plus or minus future, depending on the language that you look at. And T also contains modals, because you can't have a modal in English and then also tense. The modal is taking up the position of tense. So for I might eat bread or I ate bread, we can't say I might ate bread. Like, that doesn't work because we can only have one thing in the tense position. So for the case of we might eat bread, the general rule for tense phrases is that it introduces the noun phrase subject, it introduces tense as its head, and then it introduces the verb phrase predicate. So the tense phrase is connecting the subject and predicate with tense. So in the case of we might eat bread, we have the subject we, which is a noun phrase. We have the modal might coming under the tense head. And then we have eat bread as a verb phrase. And within inside that verb phrase, we have eat as the head of the verb phrase. And it's introducing its object, bread, for the thing that's being eaten, which is a noun phrase. For the case of I was a person, we can see the tense in action with features. So we have the subject I, and we have the tense, and here we're saying plus past. And this information has to agree with the verb. So if we put a plus past under T, that means that the verb also has to be in the past tense. That's why we see was there instead of is. If we did have is in this position, then we would have minus past to say that this is not a past tense verb. And then for the case of was, it introduces, I don't want to call this an object in the case because this is a copula, is more like assigning a property or predicate to the subject. So we'll just call this a complement. And we'll be using that term a little bit later, but you can think of anything that a category selects or requires would be considered a complement. So let's try doing the tree structure for the cat put her catnip on the plastic mat. You can try it yourself first and pause the video, and I will draw the full structure now. So I'm going to start from the top and go down, but you can start from the bottom and go up. But I want to use the phrase structure rules and what I know about grammar to kind of show you how we can start at the top, knowing that we have a sentence, and then breaking things down. So first of all, we know that any sentence is going to have a subject noun phrase, a tense, and a verb phrase predicate. So what is the subject in this sentence? Well, it is the cat. Okay. So the cat is going to consist of a determiner, the word the, and a head noun, which is the word cat. So that noun phrase is pretty straightforward. What about put? Well, the cat put is past tense. If it were present tense, it would be the cat puts her catnip on the plastic mat. So we know this is past. So we'll signal that as plus past, which means for our verb phrase, well, we have the predicate put her catnip on the plastic mat. So we need to break this up into verb and then objects or locations or indirect objects. So put would be the verb. Her catnip would be the thing, the direct object being put somewhere. And then on the plastic mat, this is where it's going. So what we have is the head verb put, and I'll do this in red because it agrees with the past tense marker on tense, which is good. But then we also have her catnip, which is a noun phrase, which consists of a determiner and noun, which would be her and catnip. And then where is it going? It's going on the plastic mat. So on the plastic mat starts with a preposition. So this will be a prepositional phrase headed by on. And then that needs to introduce a noun phrase. Now, what do we have? We have the plastic mat. So mat is going to be the head of that noun phrase. We have a determiner, which is the, introducing which mat it is. And then we have an adjective phrase, which is modifying it. So this is an adjective phrase that goes down into an adjective, barely having enough room to do this with the word plastic. So the cat plus past put her catnip on the plastic mat. So just to review why this works, we essentially have our subject noun phrase on the left, following our phrase structure rule for NP goes to D and N. It's because the cat, well, cat is the most important element of that. The dog is just being specific about it. And then we have our predicate, put her catnip on the plastic mat. Put is the main verb. This is ditransitive. It requires a direct object and it requires an indirect object, or some syntacticians will call this a location instead. But either way, it is ditransitive. So that's how we can do the tree structure for that sentence. Now, what about complementizer phrases? So we learned that complementizers exist and they're used to take a sentence and turn it into an object or subject, potentially other things in the future. So when we compare Steve knew him versus Steve knew that he was afraid, well, in one case, knew is going to take a noun phrase as a complement. And in another case, that he was afraid, it's going to take what's called a complementizer phrase as a complement. So we can say that any complementizer phrase consists of a complement C, and then it introduces a sentence afterwards. So it introduces a TP afterwards. So we would put the words like that, if, or whether under C, and then the rest of the sentence would be a TP, and we would just repeat the same process as usual. So what this means is in Steve knew him, this is just one clause. Steve knew him, one verb, one subject. So we have the subject noun phrase Steve, knew is past tense, so T is plus past, and then the verb phrase has the verb knew. It needs an object, which is him. In this case, it's a noun phrase. But if we take a look on the right tree, Steve knew that he was afraid. We should first notice that everything up to knew is exactly the same as before. And that's because nothing is changing. Steve knew is consistent whether we have a noun phrase complement object or a complementizer phrase complement in that case. So what's changing is the fact that we're now introducing a complementizer phrase, and that is headed by that. And then that just introduces another tense phrase because we have another little clause in there. It could stand on its own as a sentence if it wanted to. He was afraid, that's fine. And it just follows the same pattern as the top tense phrase. So each tense phrase will have its own subject. We have he here, and then we have a verb phrase, was afraid. Was is the verb, and afraid is the property, is the adjective that he is linked to. And of course, plus past is agreeing with was. So when you see a CP, you're introducing a whole new TP, and that means you're going to have to do a little bit of work to get the structure there, but don't be afraid of that. It's just a TP inside a bigger TP. That's all it is. So if you can do the top one, you can do the bottom one. Now, these can be subjects too. We don't usually talk like this, but we can write like this. So in the case of we bothered people, well, we have a subject NP, which is we. So bothered people would be the predicate, and it's plus past because bothered is also past tense. But there's no reason why we can't use a CP subject. So before we said that the tense phrase goes into a noun phrase, T, and a verb phrase, but it can also branch off into a complementizer phrase, a tense, and then a verb phrase. So that we were loud, this is a complementizer phrase that is headed by that. And then we just have another little TP inside. So we were loud, that's the sentence. If you can draw a TP for we were loud on its own, then you just take that tree and fit it right beside the complementizer. And then for tense phrase, past bothered people, that's going to be exactly the same as in the other tree, because again, all we're doing is modifying the subject in this case. Conjunction phrases are one of the last ones we'll talk about, and basically conjunctions join two types of the same phrase, which means if we take an XP and an XP, we join them together with a conjunction, we just get a bigger XP of the same type. So basically, if we're doing noun phrase and conjunction, then this is an NP and an NP make a bigger NP. So for steak and eggs, that's what we see. We see the noun phrase steak, we see the noun phrase eggs, it's being joined with a conjunction, and that just becomes a bigger noun phrase. We can do that with verb phrases too, adjective phrases, adverb phrases, prepositional phrases, any type really. So run or jump. Run is a verb phrase, jump is a verb phrase. With a conjunction together, we can combine them into a bigger verb phrase. And even with whole clauses, I left, but I was sad. Well, I left is a little sentence on its own. I was sad is a little sentence on its own. So when we can join them with but, we just get a compound sentence. So a bigger TP. I left, but I was sad. So try drawing the tree structure for this sentence. And you can pause the video, try yourself. I'm going to do it now. I'm going to take a slightly different approach for this. So I'm going to do it bottom up. So I'm going to write the whole sentence at the bottom. In fact, I might just cheat because I have technology. So why not make this a little bit more, there we go, a little bit simpler. So first I'll start by labeling all the categories. So she is a noun, which is a pronoun. Bought, which is a verb. A mask, determiner, a noun. For her teddy bear, so for is a preposition. Her is a determiner. Teddy bear is a noun. and, so that's a conjunction, her father, which is a determiner and noun, screams is a verb, in is a preposition, and horror would be a noun because it's following a preposition. So now that we have everything labeled, we have to figure out what the conjunction is joining. So it looks like it's she bought a mask for her teddy bear and her father screamed in horror. So if we go all the way to the top here, we're basically conjoining two sentences. So two TPs. She bought a mask for her teddy bear, her father screamed in horror. So that's going to build a big TP, which means each of the constituents on the left and right of that conjunction are also going to be a tense phrase. So for her father screamed in horror, well, her father is the subject here. So this will be a noun phrase. Horror is a noun phrase, and the preposition is introducing it. So that'll be a prepositional phrase introducing a noun phrase. And then screamed is the verb phrase there. So it's the verb, it's going to create a verb phrase, and then the prepositional phrase in horror is modifying it. So now that we have an NP and a VP, we have a subject to predicate, we can join these together to make a tense phrase, and then figure out what tense is. Well, it's screamed, so this will be plus past, and this will be our right sentence joining with the conjunction. Now, she bought a mask for her teddy bear. What about this? Well, she is the subject. So this pronoun she is going to build up into a noun phrase, and that's going to be the subject. And now we need a verb phrase. So bought is going to form a verb phrase. I don't know how many spaces I'll need to do that, but let's just say it's right there. A mask is a noun phrase. That's a thing. It's a mask. So that determiner and noun will join to make a noun phrase. And that is what she's buying. So that's going to be underneath the verb phrase next to V. Her teddy bear is also going to be a noun phrase. Something in the world. And for is a preposition introducing it. So the preposition will become a prepositional phrase and take a noun phrase as its complement there. So you're buying a mask for the teddy bear. So for her teddy bear is also describing the verb. So now we have a noun phrase and verb phrase that'll build into a tense phrase. The tense in this case will be bought. So this is plus past. And now we can conjoin our two tense phrases together to make a bigger one. So this tree looks a little bit different because I started from the bottom up. So sisters and daughters and the relations between all these phrases might not be obvious visually, but this is another method you can use for tree drawing. It's just sometimes it looks a little bit ugly because you don't give yourself enough room at the top of the page. Okay, what about in Swedish? So what we have in this example is Swedish on the top, and then we have what's called the gloss on the bottom, usually the second line. And the third line, typically we'd have a translation. However, it's kind of obvious from the word order what the translation is, so it's not included. So the gloss allows us to draw structures for sentences that we, in languages that we don't know. So a red umbrella with a yellow handle. So this is going to be a noun phrase. And because the word order is exactly identical to English, we can use the same phrase structure. So a red umbrella with a yellow handle. So umbrella is going to be the head of this phrase. Like, what are we talking about? An umbrella. Like, that's what we're talking about. And I really should be using the Swedish words in this. So I will use it. So this is paraply. Paraply. I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm sure I'll butcher it if I try to say anything. It's going to have a determiner which is et, and then it's going to have an adjective phrase, which is rot, or red. So we can put that there, just like we would in English. So it is modifying the noun, therefore it's beside it. And then we have with a yellow handle. So if we think about this category, with is introducing a yellow handle. So this will be a prepositional phrase with the prepositional with, which is mid. And then we have a yellow handle, which will be its own noun phrase consisting of a determiner et, just as we saw before, an adjective phrase with an adjective yellow, which is gult, and then handle with the word hanteg, which is the head noun of that noun phrase. So handtag. So this is a noun phrase in Swedish. It looks just like a structure for English, and that's because the word order is identical. But what happens when the word order is not identical? So this is in Hixkaryana, person dead all ate jaguar. And the translation is the jaguar ate all the dead people. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, let's just look at this sentence and realize something. The subject is on the right, and the predicate is on the left. So if we're doing a tense phrase for this, instead of putting our NP on the left and our verb phrase on the right, we're going to have to reverse this order. So it's going to be a noun phrase on the right, tense in the middle, and the verb phrase on the left. And now luckily our noun is pretty straightforward. It's one word, which would be kamara. And we have 8, so this will be plus past under T. Now for our verb phrase, we notice that the verb is on the right. So yonoye, meaning 8, would be on the right. And now for our constituent, we have all dead person, or in their word order, person all dead. So this is going to be a noun phrase. But we notice that the noun is on the left, the adjective phrase is in the middle, and the determiner all, which is como, is on the right. So if we do a tree for this, it's just going to look like the opposite of English. So in English, the subjects are on the left, predicates are on the right. In English, the head of the verb is on the left side of the verb phrase. In this language, it's on the right side. And for our noun phrase, in English, the determiner is on the left and the noun is on the right. But in this language, it's the opposite order. So when you're doing trees for other languages, you have to be considering what the constituency structure is like. And you can start by identifying subjects and predicates. And then once you identify the predicate and verb head, you can ask yourself, well, where are the objects and indirect objects in relation to that? And you just want to adjust your phrase structure rules so that way you're getting the same thing under each one. So whether it's a prepositional phrase in whatever language, you need a preposition head. It's going to introduce a noun phrase, but the order may change depending on the language. So this one would be English, and a postpositional language might be something like Japanese. So a Japanese language would have a structure more like the bottom one, where the postposition comes after the noun phrase. Prepositional phrase ambiguity is a perfect way to demonstrate that a type of phrase can appear in a different position depending on what it's doing in the sentence. So in the case of I fought the bear with an axe, there are 2 possible interpretations. The first interpretation is that with an axe is describing what the bear has. So I fought the bear and the bear happens to have an axe. The other case with an axe is describing the verb, so how you're doing the fighting. So I fought the bear and I fought with an axe. So in terms of I fought the bear, the structure would be the same no matter what. So we have a tense phrase with a noun phrase subject, past tense. Fought would be the head verb, and then it's introducing the bear. But this prepositional phrase is going to change positions depending on the interpretation of the sentence. So in the case where the bear has an axe, the prepositional phrase is right beside the noun bear. So it's underneath the noun phrase because the prepositional phrase is modifying the noun. In the case of fought the bear with an axe, the prepositional phrase is under the verb phrase, so it's beside the verb, not directly beside, but it's sisters with the verb, because it's describing the verb. So with any sort of ambiguity, with prepositional phrase ambiguity, complementizer phrase ambiguity, or even adjective phrase ambiguity, the thing that is being modified is going to affect the position of where that ambiguous phrase is going. And these structures will tell us which interpretation we're trying to get at. So that's it for constituency and phrase structure rules. The next time that we see words and trees, we're going to be modifying the system so that way we only have 2 branches at a time instead of 3. But first, let's talk about some terminology. So some tree terms. We have a structure on the right, and let's just make sure that we know what we're talking about when we use tree terms. So a branch is basically a line between two nodes. So this line going from A to B is called a branch. And a node is anything where branches connect. So these are all of the labels in our trees. So all the nodes in our trees are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I. And whenever you take two letters that are connected, they're going to be connected by a branch. So nodes have different types. The first type would be the root node. So the root node is the node at the top of the tree. It's the one where it has no parents. While terminal nodes are going to be everything that is at the bottom of the tree. So in other words, it has no children, it has no daughters. So in this case, C, E, F, H, and I are all examples of terminal nodes. Everything else in between that we haven't talked about, so things like B, D, and G, these are just called non-terminal nodes. And A is included in that, but usually if we were trying to talk about A specifically, we would use the term root instead of non-terminal nodes for that. Now, we have some relations between these. So we have some relations depending on height. So dominance is 1. And I've given some more formal descriptions for these. But dominance is basically talking about a node being higher than another node. So A is higher in the tree than D. In other words, D is one of its children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Therefore, we can say that A dominates D. In fact, we can also say that A dominates E, because you can start at A and you can trace a line all the way down to get to E. So A, in this case, is going to dominate pretty much every single node in the tree, because no matter which node we pick, we can always draw a line from A down to whatever node we have in the tree. So that's domination. Immediate domination is a little bit stricter. So immediate domination only considers the fact that a node can look down to its daughters. So in the case of immediate domination, A can see B and D. Those are its children. Those are its daughters. So A immediately dominates B and D, but it doesn't immediately dominate anything else. It dominates everything in the tree, but it doesn't immediately dominate everything. So think of it like your family and your extended family. Now, in terms of C command, this is another interesting relationship. This has a very technical term, but how you can think of it is if you want to ask if a node, let's say B, C commands another node like F. What you have to do is you have to check its sisters, so B's sisters, and everything below it. And if it's in that umbrella, then we can say there's a relationship of C command. Now, C command is going to be useful for things like binding theory, anything to do with the understanding of pronouns or scope, like quantifier semantics as well. So we're not going to see this too much, but it is a very important term to know. And if you're working with pronouns and trying to figure out what they mean in syntactic structures, you cannot live without C command. So just as another example, let's imagine we're asking if G C commands C. Well, the only thing it can do is it can check its sisters and check everything underneath them. So G would C command F and everything underneath, and then E and everything underneath. But it's kind of stuck in this barrier, and I'll try to draw it a little bit nicer than that. So it's stuck in this barrier, and specifically, it doesn't even include itself. So C is not C commanded by G, because C is not a sister of G or the daughter or any child of the nodes that G is a sister to. So in this case, yeah, C command is just basically a sistership relation plus everything underneath. It's kind of like the case of nephews or nieces or grandnephews or grandnieces, if you're thinking about familial relationships. So now we can define a constituent in terms of tree structure terminology. So a constituent is just a terminal node or a set of terminal nodes that are all dominated by the same node. So what this means is, let's say we want to ask if E and F are a constituent together. Well, E is dominated by D, F is dominated by D, but there's other stuff that's dominated by D too. So no, E and F on its own is not a constituent. But what about if we look at E, F, H, and I? Well, each of these share a same dominating node, in this case, which is D. So yes, E, F, H, and I would be a constituent because if we pick D up out of the tree and we pretend it's a physical object and dangle down these letters, at the very bottom of each branch, we would see E, F, H, and I. So what else is a constituent? Well, let's just group these all together. So first of all, each individual term or node, terminal node, is a constituent. So C, E, F, H, and I individually are. H and I are going to form a constituent together because they're both dominated by G. E, F, H, and I will form a constituent together because they're all dominated by D. And then the entire sentence, in which case this is C, E, F, H, and I, will be a constituent because they're all dominated by A. So basically how you can think of it is if you take a single node, let's say G, and you were to take it out and dangle it, then you would see that H and I would form a constituent together. If you take D out, so if we physically draw it, we're going to get E, F, G, and that'll break off into H and I. Therefore, this set of terminal nodes will form a constituent. So that is structural relations and tree terminology. So let's ask ourselves some true or false questions about the following tree and terms. So pause it yourself, try it yourself, and now I'll go through the solution. So first of all, does TP dominate VP? And even if we don't know what all these phrases and labels are, it's okay, because we just have to think about the relations. So here's the TP, and here's the VP. So can we draw a line from the TP down to VP? Well, yeah, we can go here and we can go down here. So the answer to this one is yes. The tense phrase dominates the verb phrase. Does it immediately dominate the verb phrase? Well, let's take a look. This is the tense phrase. It can see a determiner phrase and a T-bar level. This will make more sense when we talk about X-bar theory, but this is just a preview of what we're looking at. It doesn't see VP immediately. So it has to look further to see the VP. So no, it does not immediately dominate the VP. Okay, C, VP is a non-terminal node right here. Is it at the bottom? Does it have no children? Well, it has children. So yes, it's a non-terminal node. A non-terminal node will have children. What about T-bar is a terminal node? So this one. Well, this one has children too. So that means that T-bar is non-terminal. Therefore, no, it is not a terminal node. Okay. T, C commands the VP. So here's the T, and here's the VP. So if TC commands the VP, that means that the VP is either its sister or anything underneath the verb phrase. And in fact, yeah, look, very clearly, the verb phrase is the sister of T. So yes, T does C command the VP in this case. What about an F? Does the adjective C command the noun? Well, here's the adjective. So the adjective will C command its sisters and anything underneath its sisters, but it doesn't have any sisters. The adjective phrase is a head, so no, it doesn't C command N. It can't see it. But the adjective phrase can see the noun. So the adjective phrase can see the noun and everything below it. So because the noun is a sister of the adjective phrase, or it's below a sister of the adjective phrase, then yes, the adjective phrase now does in fact C command the noun. And I should have made it specific that we're talking about this noun in particular. If we were talking about the other direction, so if we're asking, does this adjective phrase C command this noun? The answer to that then would be no, because it can only see its sisters and everything below it. And even if we go the other direction, the noun can't see anything. It doesn't have any sisters. So if I give these a label, yes for N1, but no for N2. If we're giving each kid and book a different label, where book is 1 and kid is 2. So those are some questions about tree terminology and our structural relations. Now we can introduce X-bar theory. So X-bar theory is going to let us account for our constituency tests a little bit better than a flat structure. And it's also going to let us generate structures using like not necessarily a bunch of different phrase structure rules, but just our general understanding of how the language works and how all these categories combine. So essentially, instead of an X going straight to an XP, it's going to have a bunch of different positions for phrases to connect. So there's going to be a position for complements. So these are for words or phrases that are selected by a head. They're going to have adjuncts, which are going to fit between two bar levels. And these would be phrases that are optional. So if they're removed, they don't affect the core structure. Like these are adjectives and adverbs like quickly, happy, things like that. And then we have specifiers, which are very hard to define. So I'm going to not define it yet, but define it a little bit later. And essentially what we say is that X projects up to an XP. So all of these X bar levels are just projections of X. In other words, you can think of as X being some category, like let's say this is a verb, and then a verb is going to need, if it's transitive, another word to complete it. It might take some optional things like quickly. It might take something else that's optional, like in the window, and then it's going to eventually form an entire phrase to be like quickly ran into the store or something like that. So we'll get used to bar levels. They're a little bit abstract at first, but once you get used to them, it's not so bad. So with NPs, we had a flat structure, like the young new teacher of math with glasses. And this was basically a noun phrase branching out into 6 different things. We do not want this. We want every single phrase to branch off either into 1 or 2 things. So we want a structure that looks maybe a little bit more like that than something that we've had previously. So we can use constituency tests to figure out a better structure. So the young new teacher of math with glasses. First of all, any bar level, like n bar level, we can replace with the word one. So referring to some person. So we could say, instead of the young new teacher of math with glasses, we could say the young new one with glasses. And that would tell us that teacher of math is a constituent. But we don't have to say just the young new one with glasses. We could say the young new one, which would tell us that teacher of math with glasses is a constituent. We could also say the young one, which would tell us that new teacher of math with glasses is a constituent. And we could also just say the one, which would tell us that young new teacher of math with glasses is a constituent. And the idea of this was that a determiner needs to find a noun to complete a noun phrase, and adjectives, prepositional phrases, things like that will modify the noun. So as soon as it finds everything, it's going to form a noun phrase. Now, this is not the only structure that this can have. Adjuncts can really attach in different orders than they want. So there's no reason we can't say the one with glasses, and that would tell us that with glasses is like a higher constituent on the right. But we're just going to pick this particular structure to work with, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. So I'm going to put a bunch of question marks because we don't really know what they are yet. We know they're going to be bar levels, but just for the sake of demonstration, let's assume we don't know yet. So we know that teacher of math is a constituent. So those two should form together to create something. And then teacher of math with glasses is also going to form a constituent. So we should have some projection of the noun that is incorporating with glasses now. And then we can start incorporating our adjectives one at a time. So new teacher of math with glasses should be a constituent. Young new teacher of math with glasses should be a constituent. And then when we incorporate the, we get our complete noun phrase. And now we have a subject or object or indirect object in English. So the question is, all of these question marks, we're going to consider these bar levels. We're going to consider these the projection of n. So teacher of math is still an incomplete noun phrase, but the head is still a noun. We're still describing a teacher. Teacher of math with glasses, same thing. It's still going to be a noun searching for a determiner to become a complete noun phrase, but the main focus of this phrase, teacher of math with glasses, we're still talking about a teacher. So as we go up, these are all going to be projections of n. We're still dealing with an n. We haven't conformed the complete noun phrase yet. So when our final structure is complete, we have something that looks like this. Now, we're not necessarily accounting for specifiers, adjuncts, and complements properly yet. Coincidentally, this tree happens to work with it, but we will just learn about the projections first and then fix their locations later according to what their functions are in a sentence after that. So with VPs, we can do something similar too, because we don't want three branches coming out of a VP. So if we say, I drink Coke with a spoon, well, is it drink Coke as a constituent and then with a spoon after? Or is it Coke with a spoon together first and then drink comes before that on a higher level? So that's the question. Is it something like this with a VP, or is it something like this with a VP? So we can use a do-so test with this. So we can basically conjoin it with another partial sentence, or I shouldn't say partial sentence, it's another sentence with some words elided, so they're not pronounced. So we can say, I drink Coke with a spoon, and Mary does so too. So this would mean that drink Coke with a spoon is a constituent because does so too is replacing the whole thing. But we can also say, and Mary does so with a ladle. So that would mean in this position, we would want to have drinks Coke. So drink Coke should also be its own little constituent inside too. So if we're thinking about the structure with a spoon, so the prepositional phrase should be joining after the verb and the noun phrase join together first. So we want a structure on the right. So in order to do this, we'll just put a little V bar in between to say that drink Coke is still going to become a verb phrase. It's incomplete. And then with a spoon comes after. So this would be our final structure for drinks Coke with a spoon. Everything is not in the right position yet because this is an adjunct, so we'll want to redefine that later. But for now, we just want to understand the bar level projections and how we're finding these constituents. So those are verb phrases. Adjective phrases, well, typically adjective phrases just have an adjective as a head, but they can be modified by verbs or by adverbs like quite. And if you have a verb like afraid, or what's another one that would happen? Afraid. It's very hard to come up with an example on the spot. Fond of, for example, he is fond of something. Then you basically can take an of phrase after a prepositional phrase. So we don't want this three branching structure. We want to figure out which words combine with others. So I am quite afraid of spiders, but less so than Steve. So what this is telling us is that quite and less have this equivalence to them because these are both adverbs. They're talking about how afraid you are. And then so is essentially replacing afraid of spiders. So afraid of spiders is a constituent, and then quite attaches after. So if we're thinking about the structure of this, it should look a little bit like this. Of spiders attaches to the adjective to the right, and then the adverb phrase, the specifier in this case, quite, is intensifying it. It's telling you how afraid of spiders someone is. And this will form a complete adjective phrase. So this intermediate projection here should be an adjective bar. And that's exactly what we're going to see here. Everything is not, again, in the right position according to complements, adjuncts, and specifiers. But again, here we have our nice projection of the adjective joining to an adjective phrase. And then we're attaching constituents one by one according to our constituency tests and structure. So let's give a specific position for adjuncts. And adjuncts are going to be these optional phrases. So you can typically think of them as adjective phrases, adverb phrases, prepositional phrases. They're not going to be adjuncts in every single case, but if adjectives are modifying a noun, then yeah, it'll be an adjunct. So in the case of I left without fear in 40A, for example, we don't need this. We can just say I left. That's fine. So that's telling us it's an adjunct. It's optional. With the big person saw me, we can just say the person saw me. So big is an adjunct. I threw the bone very hard. We don't need to say very hard. This is an adverb telling us how the throwing was done. So we could just say I threw the bone. So very hard is going to be an adjunct. Now, specifically, we place adjuncts between bar levels. So this means if we want to incorporate an adjunct into our structure on the left or right, it needs to be between two bar projections. And the reason for this is it's just telling us that because it's between two bar levels, that this is an adjunct, that this can be removed, it's optional. So whether the adjunct appears on the left or the right, it is going to be between two bar levels. This means that if we just have a phrase like this, x to x bar to xp, and we want to incorporate an adjunct, we need to create another x bar in between that can host the adjunct either to the right or to the left. So you may have to create an extra bar level to fit in an adjunct. So here are some trees for this. I left without fear. We're just looking at left without fear. So left is our verb. It wants to become a verb phrase, so it's making some projections. But without fear is a prepositional phrase. It's optional, so we have to fit it between two bar levels. So we have a V bar beside the prepositional phrase and a V bar above the prepositional phrase. And this tells us, based on its position, that it is in fact an adjunct. What about in the case of the big person? Well, same thing here. Person is a noun, and it's going to form a noun phrase, so we have its projection. But big is an adjunct, it's optional. So we need to stick it between two n-bar levels, and that will tell us that this is in fact an adjunct. With the case of threw the bone very hard, well, the bone is the thing you're throwing, so it's required by the verb. So we're not putting the noun phrase between two bar levels because this is not an adjunct. However, very hard is an adjunct. It's an optional adverb phrase. So we want to stick this beside a V bar and below a V bar because again, through is a verb that wants to form a complete verb phrase. So it's going to project itself up through bar levels. And because adverb phrase very hard is an adjunct, we need to stick it between two bar levels. The position tells us its function. Now, complements are a little bit different than adjuncts. Complements are phrases that are required. So usually this is because the head is saying, I want another phrase after it. So the complement is what satisfies that head. It makes the sentence grammatical by including it. So one example is the case of I devoured cakes. Devoured is a transitive verb that requires a noun phrase after it. We cannot just say I devoured. It does not sound okay to most English speakers, so we don't want to say I devoured on its own. It needs a noun phrase object afterwards. So in this case, because it's selected by the head verb devoured, it is a complement. And for complements, these need to be really close to the head. So we stick them beside the head, but under a bar level. So this configuration tells us that the thing beside the head is a complement. So a verb is one case. So in other words, this would be devoured and then cakes, where this would be a verb bar, and a noun phrase after. But prepositions do this too, and so do a lot of other categories. I went into the barn. This is fine. Whenever you have a preposition, it introduces a noun phrase. So we can't just say I went into, because this preposition wants something. So the barn in this case, the noun phrase, is the complement. So if we were to do the same structure with the preposition, then we'd have a preposition head into, we would have a noun phrase complement the barn, and then this would be beside the preposition, but below the preposition bar. It is not forming a complete PP at this point, a complete prepositional phrase, because we need a specific position for complements to appear. So these are what the structure would look like in the end. I know this might seem a little bit redundant. Why do we need the V bar level and the P bar level if we can just form a complete verb phrase or prepositional phrase on its own? I've had the same questions as a student, and there are theories of syntax that do not include the bar level in this case. However, for learning these distinctions, it's important to include them because the position tells us what's going on. So cakes is beside the head and below a bar level. That tells us it's a complement. With into the barn, beside the preposition, below the P bar level. So this end noun phrase, the barn, is a complement. Now, how can you figure out if something is a complement or an adjunct? Well, here we have a very wordy slide that tells you how. So the thing with adjuncts is because they're optional, they have some order, right? So they have some free order. So if we have two adjuncts back to back, which I'm going to label these in capital letters for adjunct, what it means is if we have adjunct 1 and adjunct 2, we should be able to reorder them into adjunct 2 and adjunct 1. The other thing is that complements have to appear very, very close to heads. So if we have a head, the complement should appear right after. And that means that the adjuncts, if we want to include them, would have to appear either before the head or after the complement. We cannot have an intervening adjunct between the head and complement. So if we think about teacher of math with glasses in the classroom, we want to figure out what each of these are, we can do some reordering. And the first reordering we see is that we can say teacher of math in the classroom with glasses. So these can swap positions, which is going to tell us that in the classroom and with glasses are going to be adjuncts. But what about of math? Well, if we try to move of math further down, so we put in the classroom first, this doesn't really sound great. Teacher in the classroom of math with glasses. In fact, if you try to interpret this and say it's grammatical, something interesting happens. And that is of math is telling us about the classroom. It's in the classroom of math. What if we put with glasses in front? The teacher with glasses of math in the classroom. Of math is now telling us that we're describing the glasses. So we can't put an adjunct between teacher and of math. So this is going to tell us that actually of math is a complement in this case. It's modifying, well, it's describing the type of noun that comes before it. And although it may be optional, you can just say teacher with glasses in the classroom. Its position is very fixed. So this tells us it's not an adjunct. It cannot move around freely. It has to be right beside the head. So in terms of our structure, if we're doing our tests, of math is a complement. This is a prepositional phrase, so it needs to be right beside the head, noun, and below the bar level of the noun. And then with glasses and in the classroom, these are both going to be adjuncts. So in this case, they're going to have to be between bar levels. So beside an N bar, below an N bar. And in the classroom, same thing, beside an N bar, below an N bar. And once we have all of that together, we are going to have our complete NP. So let's try some tree structures for these phrases, the kid here with a beard and through the book at Charles Lovingly. You can pause the video, try it yourself, and we'll go through this. So with A, the kid here with a beard. Now we do have the word the here. This is a determiner. This is not going to be an adjunct. It's not going to be a complement. So we're just going to stick it beside the phrase level. And we'll change that a little bit later. But the kid here with a beard. So we could say the one with a beard or the one. So in terms of our structure, kid here, let's just label this. Kid is going to be a noun. Here is going to be an adverb. This is going to form an adverb phrase. Now, this is optional. So we could just say the kid with a beard or the kid. So this is going to be an adjunct, which means that if we want to connect it, we have to connect it between two N bar levels. So I've created an N bar above kid, and I've created one above the adverb phrase in order to connect it as an adjunct. Now, if I want to include with a beard, well, that's going to be a prepositional phrase. That's going to, well, we'll talk about the prepositional phrase in a second, but we're going to connect this at another N bar level. And now that we have all of our adjuncts joined, we can build a whole noun phrase, and then we'll include the determiner the right beside it to form the complete noun phrase. Now, in terms of kid here with a beard, so with a beard, well, with is introducing the noun phrase of beard because with needs something after it. So it's going to introduce that beside the head, but below the bar level. So with is a preposition, and then for the beard, a beard, we're going to have a determiner under our noun phrase, and we have an n bar level and an n level. We don't have any adjuncts, but we can stick beard down here. And that would be the complete structure for A. Now I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so we have room for through the book at Charles lovingly. So through the book, you're throwing something, you're throwing the book. So this is going to be a complement. And then all the phrases afterwards should be adjuncts because through is just transitive. It doesn't take any more complements. So at Charles will be an adjunct and lovingly will be an adjunct. So if we do this from the bottom up through the book at Charles lovingly, first of all, let's just label some categories. So we'll do this from the bottom up. So through is a verb, the is a determiner, book is a noun, at is a preposition, Charles is a proper name, so we'll call this a noun for now, and then lovingly is an adverb. So each of these should really form their own phrases at some point, except for the determiner. So book is going to form into a noun phrase that takes a determiner to complete it. Charles should be forming a noun phrase, and we need to connect this with at, because at Charles is a constituent. Through the book there, lovingly. So we can replace at Charles with a word like there. Okay, so this needs to connect as the complement of at. So this means that we need to introduce the P bar level and connect the noun phrase below the P bar, but beside the P. Okay, and then this can form into a prepositional phrase. And then lovingly is just going to form its own little adverb phrase without any other modifiers. So we might have to adjust the heights of some of these nodes, but what are we doing now? Well, it's through the book. The book is the complement, so this needs to connect with the verb under, beside the verb and below the V bar level. At Charles is telling us where the book is going. It's an adjunct, so it needs to be between two bar levels. And finally, with lovingly, we need to do the same thing. It's an adjunct, so we need to connect it between two bar levels. And once we've connected everything, we have a verb phrase that is complete. So it's a little bit harder to tell what the sisters and daughters and mothers are in a tree that is built from the bottom up. So we can build it from the top down too, which might make things a little bit easier to see. But typically, I recommend when you're first starting to draw things bottom up. And then once you're more comfortable with typical structures, you can do top down. So the last thing to talk about with X-bar theory are specifiers. And specifiers are stupidly hard to define, and we need really some more information to get a better definition. In the Carney textbook, determiners are treated as specifiers for a few pages, and then we're going to revise it. So I'll show it because it's in the book, and it is usually a crucial part in early syntax, saying that determiners are specifiers of noun phrases. However, specifiers really are going to be used for movement and for checking features and for assigning features to things. And we'll get to what that means a little bit later. But for now, think of specifiers as specific spots for determiners. And then we'll revise it very, very quickly. So in the case of the student, student is a noun. It builds into a noun bar, and then the determiner is going to be in a specifier position, which specifically is going to be under the phrase and beside the bar. So this is like the last thing that's going to connect to form the complete phrase, in this case, a noun phrase. So that's what specifiers are, and we'll understand what they really are in a little bit more detail later. So let's draw a tree structure for this very complicated sentence. My favorite language is a language with simple morphology and complicated syntax. So I think what I'm going to have to do in order to make enough room for this is to make a new slide and put it at the very bottom. My favorite language, and let's scale it up proportionally. My favorite language is a language with simple morphology and complicated syntax. Okay, it's going to be a little bit rough to do this bottom down. So normally what I'd say is if you're going to do it top down, to start with a tense phrase that breaks into a noun phrase, a T bar, a T. With a verb phrase, that would be a typical spine for a sentence, but we'll do this bottom up. So my favorite language will be a determiner. Favorite will be an adjective. Language is a noun. Is will be our verb. We have a determiner a. Language is a noun. With is a preposition. Simple is an adjective. Morphology is a noun. And is a conjunction. Complicated is an adjective. And syntax will be a noun. So I'm going to start right to left because that might be a little bit easier. So we're going to first form the verb phrase is a language with simple morphology and complicated syntax. So the adjective complicated is going to modify syntax, which means this has to be an adjective phrase that goes between two bar levels on the end. And remember, we're talking about complicated syntax. So syntax is the noun, that's the head of the word, that's the head of the phrase. So the noun will project itself up. Now we have an end bar here, and we're going to conjoin this with a conjunction. So this is going to form a complex noun phrase. So we want to make complicated syntax a full noun phrase at this point with no specifier. Now, simple morphology is going to have the same structure as complicated syntax. So simple is going to be an adjective phrase that modifies morphology. So this needs to be between two bar levels. This will form an NP, and it will join with the conjunction to make a more complex noun phrase. So simple morphology and complicated syntax. Now, what I'm going to do for the sake of the structure is raise this just a little bit higher, so that way we can tell what's below other things. Okay, now with. It's with simple morphology and complicated syntax. So our noun phrase will be the complement of with. With requires something to come after. What that means is that this is going to be a P bar that takes the noun phrase as its complement, and this will form a prepositional phrase. Now, with simple morphology and complicated syntax is a prepositional phrase that is modifying language. What type of language is it? Well, it's a language with simple morphology and complicated syntax. So this is going to be an adjunct that connects between bar levels. So we'll make an N bar and another N bar above it and connect the prepositional phrase in between. And in order to form a complete noun phrase, we're going to connect it with the determiner a. Now, is, my favorite language is. Well, is wants a noun phrase after it. So this means we're going to need a V bar that takes the noun phrase as its complement. And now that we have a V bar, well, my favorite language, and then we have the predicate after, this is now a complete predicate, so that will form a verb phrase. Now we're going to have to connect this with my favorite language, but first we'll finish my favorite language as the subject, and then we'll incorporate tense afterwards. So again, favorite is describing language. So this should be an adjective bar that builds into an adjective phrase. And because this is an adjunct, it needs to be between two N bar levels. Now, to complete the noun phrase, we're going to take the determiner as a specifier. So at this point, I am going to take the tree on the right, and I'm going to make it just a little bit smaller. I don't want everything. I just want this bit. So I'll make that a little bit smaller. We'll move the verb around so these words are not going to line up completely. But now we're able to connect these two with tense. So a tense phrase will branch out into the noun phrase subject and a T bar. And the T bar is going to select minus past because our verb is, and it takes the verb phrase as a complement. So that is how that's going to work. Although I've realized we haven't talked about that in X bar structure yet. So if we just go with the typical form, this would just be a tense phrase that connects the verb phrase and the noun phrase with tense underneath. But just a little preview for the T bar, which we're going to be talking about very shortly. So that's just a basic primer to X bar theory, and we're going to now talk about adding functional categories like tense phrases, complementizer phrases, and determiner phrases. At this point, we can now start talking about functional categories. So we want our structures to account for all of our functional heads as well. So things like determiners, tense, complementizers, auxiliaries, and voice. So what this means is that each of these types of words should have their own phrase and therefore their own projection through bar levels as well. So we'll start with determiners. Now, determiner phrases are going to take noun phrases as complements. So instead of starting with a noun phrase that takes a determiner as a specifier, which is why we showed it very late, we are instead going to say that determiner is a head that takes a noun phrase as a complement, and the determiner phrase may have a specifier in a possessive relationship. So we're going to redefine our D to form a DP with the noun phrase as a complement, so beside the head and below the bar level. So if we have something like the cat, then the is going to be a determiner, and cat would be a noun phrase. If we wanted a more elaborate structure, we would still write our noun phrase and bar and n below it before we get to cat. Now, one of the big arguments for DPs, aside from gerunds and some other things, is the possessor-possessive relationship. So in the case of my mother's dog, or the kid over there's cat, or every person's best friend, we note that the genitive s, so the possessive affix, does not necessarily attach to one word, but rather to the whole determiner phrase. So it's every person's best friend. It's not like it's one singular person's best friend and then every is modifying that. No, the possessive s belongs to every person. Or the kid over there's cat is appearing after an adverb in this case. Well, I guess over there, preposition introducing a noun phrase, whatever you want to call it. And then for my mother's dog, this is specifically my mother's dog, so the possessive s is attaching afterwards. So we believe that the possessive s is a determiner head that's going to have its own projection, so D, D bar, and DP, and the possessor is going to be the specifier of the possessive s, and the thing that's being possessed is going to be the complement of the possessive s. So it's like a DP that contains two other DPs in it. So what is this going to look like? Well, in the case of the three example sentences, my mother's dog, the kid over there's cat, and every person's best friend, we see in each case the possessive s has its own little projection up the spine. And then my mother in this case will be a determiner phrase that is the possessor, and then dog would be the case that is the thing being possessed. Even with the kid over there's cat, we're going to see that same pattern. We see the possessive s building up into a DP, and then we have that possessor-possessed relationship. So the kid over there is the specifier because that's the possessor. Every person is the specifier because it's the possessor. And then the cat is the thing being possessed, and so is the best friend. So those are both in complement positions. And if we wanted the full structure, we would just elaborate a little bit more, but this is mainly how we're going to use DPs. We should also note that now when we have proper names or we have pronouns, these are also now going to be determiner heads. So the idea for that is that you cannot have noun phrases following them. We can't say I person or John dog. We need something else in order to make it okay. So it's basically taking up the position of determiner instead of a noun phrase. It's also a little bit weird to say the John unless you're trying to say it emphatically, or the he, which would be just be like ungrammatical in general. Now, complementizer phrases are going to work in a very similar way without any sort of possessor-possessive relationship. And we're going to say that complementizer phrases introduce clauses. So what the C head is going to tell us is it's going to give us some features. It's either going to tell us that it's a declarative sentence if C is empty. So what we can say, and we'll define this later, is saying that it's not forming a question and it's not looking for a WH word to do so. But in the case of interrogative sentences, like yes, no questions, or in WH questions, which we'll see a little bit later, the C head is going to take the first thing in the auxiliary chain. So if we have John will run to the store is an active sentence, the auxiliary or modal will is going to move up into the C position. And here we're going to give it some features. So this would be a plus Q. It's a question, but we're not asking for a WH word because this is yes, no. Again, we'll go into that into more details later. But C is going to be telling us basically which type of sentence we're looking at. Is it declarative or is it interrogative? We'll also elaborate a little bit more on tense phrases. So you saw a preview of this in the last exercise in this video, but instead of having a three-branching TP where the tense phrase goes to the subject, the tense, which would just be T, and then the predicate, we are instead going to have that bar structure. So tense is going to build up into a T bar, which builds up into a tense phrase. And the specifier of the tense phrase is going to be the subject of the sentence, well, of the clause, and the complement of tense is going to be our predicate. I was going to say object, but it should be predicate in this case. So that is going to be the typical relationship in all TPs. So in the case of I slept, again, we have that tense spine going up, and then I is the subject, so it's the specifier, slept is the predicate, so it is going to be the complement of T. And in the case of I could sleep, remember we said that modals and tense appear in the same place, so we can put could under tense, we're going to get that same spine as before, and we're going to get the determiner phrase as the specifier and the verb phrase as the complement, so our predicate. Now, we could have different types of auxiliaries in there as well, so we shouldn't just believe that it's only a VP. It could be an auxiliary phrase, a perfect phrase, a modal phrase, but the important part is that the position beside T as its complement is telling us it's the predicate of the sentence. So there's one analysis of T where T actually has two components. It has the grammatical feature, so either plus, minus, past, or a modal. And if it's plus past, then it would have an affix that comes with it, like ed or some other past form. And what's happening is that this tense is being lowered down to the next thing in the verb chain. So it could be on an auxiliary if it's there. In this case, we just have a verb. So it moves its morpheme down and it combines with the verb, and that's how we get the form jumped in the sentence I jumped. Now, in not all trees will you see this being done, but you can imagine that implicitly this is what's happening. So now we'll introduce our auxiliaries. So the first one is the progressive phrase, and this is always going to be the word form be, and specifically it's providing the progressive ing to the next thing in the auxiliary or verb chain. And we can do lowering with this, but first let's take a look at the example on the left. So be, we're going to call this a progressive. We'll build into a progressive bar and a progressive phrase. Now, the progressive cannot stand on its own. It needs to select something. So in this case, it will select a verb phrase, but it could be selecting something like the passive, for example. Had been being slept, or had been being beaten, or something like that. So what we can say, if we're doing the same analysis with the tense phrase with morphemes, is that the progressive splits into its form be, and it comes with this ing progressive form that will lower down to the next thing. So if we have be sleeping, or is sleeping, or was sleeping, this ing forms with the verb sleep to make the full form sleeping. And sleeping, in this case, or was sleeping, is telling us that an event is or was continuous at some point in time. Now, the perfect phrase will always come with auxiliary have, so it'll take the have form, and it will give a suffix like ed or en, basically the participle form, to the next thing in the chain. So in the case of have eaten, we can see this en at the end, that's the participle form, so we can analyze it as the perfect having have, and then en, and then taking that and lowering it down to the next thing for have eaten. We can also very clearly see the spine here. So have is a perfect joining to a perfect bar up into a perfect phrase. And it's taking the VP or something else in the auxiliary chain following it as its complement because it's basically selecting for it. We cannot have perfect have on its own. If have is on its own without something after it in terms of a predicate, then what that means is that we just have a typical transitive verb, which has some possession of, or some meaning of possession. Now, in terms of the verb chain, we can combine a lot of these. So we can say, I have been eating lunch, in which case we would have minus past on tense. have as a perfect, being as a progressive, and eating would be the verb. And in each of these cases, we can see that some of these morphemes are moving around. So on the tree to the right, we're showing that movement explicitly. So minus past doesn't have anything to give to the next thing in the chain. So it attaches to have, and basically nothing happens to it. We're not adding anything to it. The perfect has the en marker, so that's joining down with the next thing in line, which is be, to make the form being. And then the ing from the progressive is moving down to the verb eat in order to form eating. So in terms of this chain, it's not that these suffixes are always going directly to the verb, it's just that it's going down to the next thing in line. And we can show that with movement, but for the most part in trees, we will not be showing that explicitly. Now, it's also important to note there's a very explicit order in which all of these things must occur. So tense and modal occurs first, then the perfect, then the progressive, then the verb. This is just the standard word order in English. We cannot mix them up. So if we did progressive, then perfect, it would be something like was for the progressive, and then you'd have the have, so that was having, and then we would want a verb after that. So eaten, was having eaten, and that would be ungrammatical if we did the progressive and perfect in that order. So the perfect must come before the progressive. The progressive cannot come first in this chain. The word order is very strict. Now, one of the last functional categories is going to be voice phrases. Now, voice phrases are going to tell us whether the sentence is active or passive. And in the case where it's passive, it will give the participle form to the following verb. And this will be the last thing that we see in our verb chain before the verb phrase. So in the case of James won a competition, this is an active sentence. It has its agent as a subject, so the person doing the action. And then in the passive version, so a competition was won by James, the agent has essentially been demoted. So it's become optional. We don't need to say who was the winner of the competition. We can just say that competition was won. So if it's active, then under the voice head, nothing is pronounced because active sentences don't have some special auxiliary that we need to include to tell us that it's active. But if it's a passive, then it takes the form of be and it gives the verb a participle form. So let's say this is past, then we would have was, and then the verb won would be in its participle form. Now, one is going to be the same if it's past or participle, but if we take a verb like eat, if it's just plus past, it's going to be ate. But if it is passive, what we would get is the form eaten. So in the case of was eaten in this case. And this is going to be the same thing as its form with the perfect had eaten. So in terms of the chain now, we're just adding voice right before the VP. So that is where the voice P is going to occur. And there'll be some interesting things that voice P does when we talk about head generation and movement. So let's try drawing a tree structure for this sentence. Steve thinks that the new contestant could have been winning. You might run out of room here, but you can pause it, try it yourself, and I'll go through this now. So I'm going to take a top-down approach, and that's because now we have a decent idea of what the chain is going to be like. So in general, we can start by saying that every sentence starts with a CP. That C is going to take a tense phrase as a complement, branching into a subject and T bar, which branches into tense, and then a verb phrase in this case because of the verb thinks. And this will branch down into the verb and then take a complementizer phrase as its complement because we're going to get that the new contestant should have been winning, where that is a complementizer. And it's very clear that the new contestant could have been winning is going to be, it could be a sentence on its own. So when we fill in some of this, we're going to get that C has nothing pronounced because it's a declarative sentence. Steve is going to be our subject, which is now going to be a determiner. Thinks is present tense, so we'll write minus past under T, and then thinks will be the verb. Now, to get that the new contestant could have been winning, we're going to draw that CP, and we're basically going to put a little arrow to fit it in just for the sake of space. So this will be a CP that goes into a C bar with C, but now C has a word in it, which is going to be that. It is a complementizer, so that is being fit into that structure. Then we're just going to repeat our TP node. So this is going to branch off into a determiner phrase subject with T bar for tense. And then what is going to be under T? Well, we have a modal in this case, could. So could is going to fill that position. But then what do we have? Have been winning. So this is going to be a perfect phrase that goes to a perfect bar with perfect have. So we're accounting for our first auxiliary in this case. Then we're going to be making a progressive phrase in order to get been, our other auxiliary here. So that's going to break off into a prog bar and progressive. And I'm going to fit the word been down there. And then we can continue with the rest of the verb phrase, which would just be winning in this case. And although I could show all of the movement for the affixes, we can just assume that it is implied in this case. So the structure looks a little bit different, mainly because once these structures get a little bit big, we lack space, so we might break them up into components and just draw arrows. But if you have a piece of paper or a document that you're writing on that is not widescreen, but is instead in portrait format, then you would be expected to put the whole tree on that page. So one thing we didn't do was the new contestant. So that's the subject of the inner TP. So we know this is going to be a determiner phrase that has a determiner head. So that's going to be the word the. It is going to take new contestant as a complement. So that's a noun phrase where the adjective phrase new is an adjunct. So I'm going to abbreviate this a little bit with a triangle. That just means there's a hidden adjective bar and adjective down there. And then we're going to finish off our noun with contestant. So this is going to be the final structure for this. I'm sure if I make some adjustments to this, we can see the full thing in action, although we're going to have to scale things down just a little bit. So let's remove some of these markers. Let's scale these down a little bit. Fit that in there. We'll remove the CP. So we get a little structure like that. Being is kind of straggling under the verb phrase when it should be a progressive. And then we'll take this and we'll fit it underneath our structure to get the full thing, which is just slightly off screen. But if we pull this all up, maybe we can see it over here to the right. So this is what the full tree looks like when we put everything together and we make it small enough that it fits on a page. And now we can start talking about deep structure. So where are words generating and why are some sentences bad? So this is theta theory, also known as thematic roles or semantic roles. And this talks about the verb's requirements for what types of subjects and complements that they want. So for example, we can say, I gave a rock to Mary. And this is going to be a ditransitive verb. It's going to have a direct object, the thing being given, and an indirect object, which is where it is being given to. Now, we cannot say I gave a rock without some sort of implication on who it's being given to. So under certain contexts, it's fine. I gave blood would be an example. You're donating blood. But we definitely can't say I gave Mary. So we can't say it without a direct object. But there's also some weirdness too. Because if you say the rock gave me to Mary, it doesn't sound quite right because the rock isn't something that can give something. And also people aren't things that you can give to other people. So it's not ungrammatical, but semantically it's weird. So subcategorization, the complements that it's selecting specifically in terms of category, can only account for why B and C are bad. But the weirdness of D can't be accounted for that. So in order to account for that weirdness, we're going to introduce thematic roles or theta roles. So there's different types of theta roles, and you can assume that theta roles apply to DPs, and in some cases they apply to PPs. But basically they are arguments of the verb. So Agents are our first main thematic role, and these are things or people that can initiate actions. So in Joseph kicked the ball, the kicker is Joseph. He's the one doing the kicking. In Stephen kills, Stephen is the one doing the action of killing. In Mary danced the night away, Mary is the one doing the action of dancing. They are the ones that can initiate those actions. So if you say something like a pebble kicked the ball, you'd be saying, well, that's a little bit weird because pebbles can't initiate actions because they're just rocks. Like they don't do anything. So agents can, the verb can enforce an agent as its subject. So that way we don't have any semantic weirdness and it's picking a type of subject that can actually initiate that action. Experiencers are a little bit different. Instead of initiating actions, they're people or things that experience or perceive an event. So in the case of Joseph felt sad, well, the one feeling sad is Joseph. So he's experiencing sadness. In the case of Trevor likes ice cream, which is very true, I'm the one experiencing the feeling of liking. I'm not like actively liking it. I'm not making a conscious choice to like something. This is something I experience or feel. In the case of complex tree structures frighten me, well, something in here is experiencing being frightened, and that is me. So I'm experiencing the feeling of being frightened, and complex tree structures are the ones that are initiating that frightening feeling. So although in all the previous examples we've had subjects taking these roles, these don't have to be limited to subjects. They can occur in different positions. So we really have to think about the meaning of our determiner phrases to figure out what type of role it is. Now we have a couple more. The first one is theme, and theme is always difficult to define. Usually I think of these just as objects of verbs that have agents. So in the case of Joseph kicked the ball is the thing that is being kicked. So this is the theme. A more formal definition are entities that undergo actions that are moved, experienced, or perceived. But I typically just like to think of these as the people that are affected by the action. So in Stephen kills Tyler, in this example explicitly, Tyler is the person who is experiencing or being affected by the action of Stephen kills. In the case of too many people are eating beans, the question is like, well, what are they eating? So beans in this case, this is the theme. This is what the verb is acting upon. Now, for indirect objects or locations, we have goals and recipients. I shouldn't say locations. I should say these are things or places or people that something is being moved to. So, when we say the cheerleading squad went to New York, there's two ways to analyze this. One is saying that to New York is a goal in itself, but some linguists will say it's just New York. We'll go and say that the entire prepositional phrase in this case is a goal. So when you say the cheerleading squad went to New York, this is their destination. This is where they ended up. There's some sort of movement from a place to New York. We don't know where it came from, but we know where it ended up. In the case of I gave a book to my friend, this is very similar. This is a prepositional phrase containing the indirect object, and this is where the book is being transferred to. So it's going from one place to your friend. And in this case, we might make a distinction and say that to my friend is the recipient because they're receiving something, while goal is just a location that you end up at. So we might make that distinction, although some papers and linguists don't necessarily make the biggest distinction between those two because these both end up as prepositional phrases with destinations. Now, as far as our last three go, we have source, location, and instrument. This is why I didn't want to say that location is a good word for goal or recipient. But we'll start with source. So source is just the opposite of a goal. If you have an entity to where something is going, then you have an entity from which something is going, or a place where something is coming from. So Trevor came from a small town in BC. So this is a source. This is where I grew up. So from a small town in BC is a source. In the case of my friend gave me a new tire, my friend in this case is the person that is providing the new tire. So it's coming from your friend and it's going to me. So either the goal or the recipient in this case, however you want to look at it. My friend could also be an agent in this case because my friend is the one actively doing the action of giving. So sometimes you can infer that a DP might have more than one potential thematic role. It's just about choosing which is the best one to assign it given a certain context. Now, locations are places where events take place. So this is not a destination or a source. This is just the immediate location where the verb is happening. So when you say, I am now in New York is a location. This is where I am currently. I'm not talking about where I'm going or where I'm coming from. I'm talking about where I'm at. Same with we're in the lobby. This is where the existence of us is at the current moment in time. We are in the lobby. Now, the last one is instrument. So this is what you perform actions with. So I finished the homework with a pencil. With a pencil is telling us how we did the finishing. We did this with this pencil. And I bought movie tickets with money. This is what I'm using to purchase movie tickets with. So I am buying something with money, with some sort of object or entity. Now, given that, we can take a look at these three sentences and try to assign thematic roles to them. So we'll just underline all of the DPs and prepositional phrases that we might want to assign roles to. So you can pause the video, try it yourself, but let's go through this. So in the case of Mary felt sad, Mary is experiencing an emotion. So this is an experiencer with Mary. Mary is not actively feeling sad. She's not consciously initiating the action of feeling sad. So this is not an agent. This is something that she perceives. Now, in the case of James climbed a giant tree with claws, James has to initiate the action of climbing. He cannot just passively do this. So James is our agent. A giant tree is the thing being climbed on. So this is our theme. It's being affected by the action of climbing. And with claws is telling us like how we did the climbing. So this, in this case, is an instrument because it's telling us like when we did the climbing, what sort of object did we do it with? Well, with claws. Now, in Jessica flew from Toronto to Montreal, we is flew an agent or an experiencer in this case. I mean, we can say it's an agent because you make the conscious decision to fly. And if we were to compare this with a bird or something, the literal meaning changes a little bit, but still, Jessica is initiating the action of flying. It's coming from Toronto to Montreal. So we have a source where it's coming from and a goal to where it's going. So Jessica flew from Toronto to Montreal. Now, to finish up theta theory, we should think about the verbs because the verbs are the ones who are selecting not only the type of phrase they want as subjects and complements, but also the thematic roles. So we can make these theta grids. They might look a little bit different depending on the book you use, but this notation just really abbreviates those boxy diagrams if you've been seeing them. So first of all, these are ordered brackets, which means that the order matters. So in the verb like give, we know that give is ditransitive. Specifically, it wants a determiner phrase subject. It wants a determiner phrase direct object. Sorry, I wrote subject again. This should be DO. And then the prepositional phrase is going to be the indirect object where it goes to. And that's just one form of give. We could do the double object construction, but this is the one where we say I gave something to someone. So we say it C selects these categories. This just means it like category selecting those things. So this is about the syntax, the type of phrase. But in terms of thematic roles, it wants specifically in the order the subject to be the source, the direct object to be the theme, the thing being given, and then it wants a goal for where it's going to. And we call this S selection because this is about the selection of semantics. And these will line up. So it's like saying give wants a subject source. It's C selecting a determiner phrase, but it's S selecting a source. Then it wants a determiner phrase theme. So it's C selecting a determiner phrase, but it's S selecting a theme, and those two combine. So verbs can have different forms. So if we take a look at kill intransitive and kill transitive, we might notice they're a little bit different. So if kill is intransitive, it just wants an agent. So it's C selecting a DP and it's S selecting an agent. But if it's transitive, it wants a subject and an object. It's C selecting a DP and S selecting an agent for its first argument, and then it wants a DP theme for its second argument. And if those conditions are filled, then we'll get a grammatical sentence. So the theta criterion is our official theory or theorem that makes sure that this alignment happens. So the theta criterion explicitly states each argument is assigned one and only one theta role. This means that if we have a DP, we can only give it one theta role. So if we want to give an agent, it cannot give anything else in that same sentence or same clause. And then each theta role will be assigned to one and only one argument. This means that if the agent corresponds with a DP that is a subject, for example, let's say we get a DP that's an object, we cannot assign agent to that DP within the same clause because the one thematic role goes with one argument. So in other words, one phrase with one role, that's a one-to-one correspondence in each clause. And this allows us to explain all these grammatical problems, so with not having enough arguments or too many arguments, but it also allows us to explain weirdness. So like if we need an agent and we're getting something that can only be a theme, then the sentence is going to be a little bit weird. So if we have the sentence, the book loves Steve to John, we know that this is ungrammatical. It's weird. And to John specifically is the weird part. Now, why is that? It's because loves wants an agent and it wants a theme. And it only has room for that. It's only selecting those two things. So we cannot take an indirect object goal because the verb loves is not selecting for it. So we can't just assign, we can't just say that loves wants an extra PP and it doesn't want any thematic role because it only wants two things. So we can't give it three. So this is how the theta criterion works in action. Now, there are some verbs and some verb phrases that don't actually select for any thematic roles. So in the case of it rained or it poured, these are weather verbs. It doesn't actually refer to anything. So for example, it is ungrammatical to say he rained. So it can't take any sort of agent in this role. It would also be weird to have like a theme. So the book rained would not be okay in this case either. It's a little odd. So this is a word, it. It's called an expletive because it appears in order to make a sentence grammatical, but it doesn't have any thematic role assigned to it. Same with the sentence, it is apparent to people that I am a linguist. It is not referring to anything in the world. This is not a pronoun. This is an expletive in this case. So we can get these expletive structures by doing some of that movement. So it is apparent to people that I'm a linguist. So that phrase has been extraposed to the end of the sentence, so we can stick it back as a subject. So that I'm a linguist is apparent to people. In other words, it is a CP that is just acting as a proposition that appears before is apparent. So when we think about the verb is apparent, so this would be a verb plus an adjective, but we'll just call it a verb for simplicity right now. It's only selecting one thing. It is only selecting that CP after it, which is a proposition. So how you can think of this is just a clause, like it wants a fact. A fact or opinion. And I'll make that U a little bit more round. Okay, so it's not selecting an agent. It's not selecting some sort of subject there. So because it has no subject, we need to insert something to make it grammatical. So we can insert expletives it or there in order to make the sentence grammatical. And the extended projection principle is going to give us some motivation to do so. So the extended projection principle is pretty straightforward. It just says that all clauses must have subjects. So what this means is that if we have a tense phrase with a T bar and T and some sort of predicate verb phrase, the specifier position has to be filled. So in other words, we need to insert a DP into that position in order to make a sentence grammatical. So if there is no subject, like let's say we have a sentence like 59A, which is ungrammatical, is apparent that I'm here. We know that's not a complete sentence, but there's no agent to give a thematic role to in order to fill out the subject position. So what do? Well, the EPP says we need something in the specifier of TP. We need a subject. So this is where we introduce the expletive in order to fulfill that projection principle in order to make our sentences grammatical. So let's take a look at some sentences and explain why they're ungrammatical using theta theory. So the first sentence is Alphino set on the box. Alphino set on the box. Well, if we think about the verb set, what do we want? Let's think of thematic roles. We want an agent. So someone is setting something. So we want a theme as well. And then it needs to go to a location, agent theme, and then on the box. Oh, it's not really a location. It's more like a goal in this case. So this is going to be a ditransitive verb. So specifically, Alphino sets something on the box. We want a determiner phrase theme, and then a prepositional phrase goal. If we look at this sentence, it has its agent, it has its goal, but it's missing a theme. It's missing a theme that corresponds to some determiner phrase, therefore it is ungrammatical. What about the case of Alice slept the floor? Well, in the case of slept, it has very specific requirements. It only wants a subject. So it wants a determiner phrase that is, we'll call it an experiencer in this case, since you experience sleep. It's kind of hard to actively be initiating sleep for a lot of people. So because it just wants a subject experiencer, that means that the floor, which would be a theme, is not being selected. So it doesn't want a theme after it. But because it's getting a theme after it, another determiner phrase that it's not selecting for, the sentence is now ungrammatical. So that's how we can use a theta criterion and notions of C selection and complements in order to explain why some sentences are bad or just semantically weird in general. Now that we know what verbs are selecting as far as thematic goes for DPs and PPs go, we should also consider what types of complements that verbs want. Because verbs can select complementizer phrases as complements, but in the case of the word believe, we can only say believe that something. As soon as we say believe whether or if, or believe for, or believe with an infinitive phrase like to be here, the sentence comes out as ungrammatical. So believe has a very specific requirement for what the complementizer can be, which is the word that. Now, if you think about the verb like inquired, we can't say I inquired that you are here. That doesn't sound right. So it doesn't take the complementizer that, but it can take the complementizer whether or if. So I inquired whether you're here or not, or I inquired if you're here. We also can't do these for you are here clauses or to be here infinitive phrases, which will also be clauses on their own because they can have subjects and objects. So for inquired, very specifically, we are choosing the words whether or if that can be the head of that complementizer phrase. So instead of picking particular words, we are going to pick features in order to discuss the verb requirements on the complementizer. So different C heads will have different features, and these will be in the form of cues and finiteness. So finite just means that the verb in the clause has tense on it, and minus Q would be not a question, plus Q would be a question. So when you have a complementizer like that, we are saying that it is finite, the clause is going to have tense, and you're not going to have a question there. For a complementizer like for, this is going to be not a question, and it's going to be non-finite. So you would have to put an infinitive there, like in the to form. With if and whether, this is pretty similar to that, except this forms an embedded question. So I don't know whether you're here or not. That whether you are here or not, or if you are here or not, can be thought of as possible to answer with a yes or no. So it is question-like. It's not a question on its own, but it does have that form and meaning of a question. And then if there's nothing under C, so it's just empty, then we'd say that it's going to be a declarative sentence minus Q, and the finiteness can range. So that is what our Q's and finites mean. So when we think about what believe wants, and we ask ourselves, well, it's selecting a CP that is going to be a proposition. Instead of just saying proposition in general, we could be more specific. So we could say it wants a minus Q plus finite complementizer. Okay, so there are some complementizers that allow an infinitive after. So I think that he is here. Very specifically, this has tense. So this is finite in this case. But we can't say I think to be here. We would need more in order for that to be grammatical. Now, I want to be here. This is okay. Now, this is non-finite, so it doesn't have tense. And the form to be here is what's known as an infinitive. So if we're asking ourselves what the complementizers want as far as the TP after it, or in the case of want, where it can't even take a complementizer afterwards, we can be specific about what we want. So that, I think that he is here, this is a complementizer, and it's very specifically selecting for a tense phrase that is not infinitive. So I write minus infinitive there. In the case of want, well, I want to be here. I want that he is here. Well, this is infinitive, so it's going to select a CP that is not a question and it is not finite. In other words, it is tenseless in this case. We could just write plus infinitive in this spot. It's really your choice on how you want to write or denote that. So modals have selections too. So I should eat. This is a very specific form of the verb, which is, again, its infinitive form. So it's the form that comes after the word to eat. Now, we can't say I should eating, I should eaten, or I should ate. All of these are not going to be okay. So as far as very specific requirements, what should is selecting, and modals in general, they want a verb phrase or something like a verb phrase, like a perfect phrase or progressive phrase, that is verbal and it is in its infinitive form. So that's how we would draw a little theta grid for should, but we're not using the box structure, we're just using this arrow notation. In terms of tense, tense is going to have some selection too. It's not going to care whether a VP, perfect phrase, or progressive phrase comes after it, but it does want something very specific. And that is, if tense is plus past, it is going to take 8. We can't say I eat with past tense. We can't say I eaten with past tense and I eating with past tense. If we're going to have past tense in there, it should be selecting something that's past. So if tense is past, then it's going to be selecting the next thing in line that is of the past form. Now, as far as aspects go, depending on the type of aspect, it'll be selecting for different forms, and we can think about these as the suffixes that are going onto the next form. So have is either going to take a progressive phrase, voice phrase, or verb phrase after, and it's going to want something in its participle form. So in other words, when we say have eats, we know exactly which form we need. We need this en participle form on the verb. Now, if we're having a progressive be, this is going to select either a voice phrase or a verb phrase, and it wants its form to be in the progressive. So be, eat, and then we have this ing, which is telling us that it's in the progressive form. Now, if we have passive was or is, so passive be, specifically this is going to want a VP because it can't select anything else afterwards, and it wants it in its participle form. So this is be plus the same participle form that have is trying to select. So by using features now, we don't have to think about affix lowering. We can just think about all of these verbs selecting specific forms, and if that form does not show up, we have an ungrammatical sentence. So at this point, we're going to start talking about movement, but we have to understand the theory and architecture of generative grammar first. So we've been working in surface structure, which is the sentence that comes out of your mouth. It is what is pronounced. And surface structure can either go into phonetic form, so saying it out loud, or it can go to logical form for interpretation. So this is where ambiguous sentences, like with different quantifiers, 2 bodybuilders move 6 trucks, that has a couple meanings. So this is where those things will get taken care of. But deep structure cares about where words generate according to requirements in the grammar. So we're going to be incorporating thematic roles to tell us where determiner phrases should be generating. And we're going to be moving words around to form correct sentences and to make questions and things like that. So from deep structure to surface structure is where all of our movement is going to take place. And we're going to be left with something in surface structure. These are usually abbreviated as DS and SS if you ever see these in papers or textbooks. So how is head-to-head movement motivated? Well, we can think about the following French sentence. I eat often the apples. Je mange souvent des pommes. I don't know how to pronounce it completely, but something like that. Now, if we think about a structure for this, we would have a tense phrase that goes down into tense. So it's eat, so it's minus past. We do have a determiner phrase with the subject, I. But as soon as we get into the verb phrase, we get something a little weird. And that is, if we think about the placement of the verb and the object, the verb should be before the object. And because the object DP is a complement of the verb, they have to be side by side. Now, if we were to go up this tree and think about the word often, this is an adjunct, so it has to occur between 2 bar levels. And no matter which side we put it on, we're not going to get the right word order. And that is because eat in the actual French sentence occurs before the adverb and also before its direct object. So, in order to get a correct structure, we have to pose and, assume, but also prove that something is going to have to move in this sentence. So V to T movement allows us to get the correct word order. It means that the word eat is starting under the verb. It has its object complement in this case. It has its adjunct often, but then to get the correct word order, we're moving eat up into the tense phrase, up into T. So before there was minus past, so you can think of the verb joining together with minus past to form the final form. And this allows us to get the correct word order for this French sentence. And what's interesting is that it might not just have to be the verb. It could be the first thing in the auxiliary chain as well. So with negative sentence, I eat not the apples, eat really should be generating right before the words the apples, because that's just how French word order works. But we can see in 67, the sentence below, we have I have not eat the apples. And we very clearly see that the apples is coming immediately after the verb, because the apples would be the direct object of the verb, so it has to be its complement. But what we see in 67 is that it's not eat that has moved up beside the subject. It is have. It's the perfect. So what this means is that have originated right before the word eat and has moved up. So it's going from the perfect position in the tree up into the T position. So it's not just that the verb is moving in every case, it's more so that the first either modal, auxiliary, or verb head is moving, whichever one is highest in the tree. So we're going to see pretty similar things in English, not V to T movement, but just talking about things moving in general cases. So if we think about English, well, first of all, I'll look at the structure on the right because this is what shows off what we just talked about. Instead of the verb moving up, we're taking the first thing in this auxiliary chain and verb chain here, so have, and moving it up into the T position to get the correct word order. So English does not need to do this. However, when we talk about questions in English, like I will run to be will I run, we're going to have to move something up. And we're going to have to move an auxiliary into T and then to C in order to make a question. So we will see this here. Now consider like you were running. Were you running? So we're taking the first auxiliary and we're moving it to the front of the sentence. So if this you is in the position of the specifier of the tense phrase, that means we need to move it more left. So what we're going to do is we're going to take have in its perfect position. We'll first move it up to tense, and then after it goes up to tense, we'll move it up to C in order to form a question. And C in this case is going to have the specific feature that says plus Q, which is going to license the question. Now, we cannot move the verb. So we can't say like eaten, you have the hamburger. We can't just take the verb out. We have this chain of have and eaten. So if we do the second one in the chain rather than the first one, it's ungrammatical. Instead, we have to take our first auxiliary in that chain and move that one up instead. So we're very limited. Now, why do we have T movement? Like, why does it go from the perfect to T first and not just straight to C? Well, do support is going to show us how that works, and we will see that. So if we have a sentence like you like Fred, and we want to form this into a question, we can't just take like and move it up because we're not allowed to move verbs. English does not allow that. So instead what we have to do is we have to insert an auxiliary do right before the word like. So you do like Fred, and this is going to start in T, and then T is going to move into the C position to get the phrase, do you like Fred? So how this would work is we don't have any auxiliary, so we're introducing do into T for you like Fred, and then we're going to move that into the C position where there's a plus Q feature that allows us to know that this is a sentence. So if you don't have any auxiliary, you need to insert do under T in order to do movement. This is going to be the same thing with negation phrases. So you do not eat. You have to include do in those sentences as well when you have not right before the verb. So let's draw a tree structure for this sentence. Has Sylvia been preparing the report? So you can pause it and try it yourself, but I'm going to go through the solution now. So this is going to be a complementizer phrase. That's all clauses, and it's going to have a C head and then branch into a TP from the C bar level. Now, I'm not going to show any movement yet. Let's start by base generating our sentence. So what I mean by this is our initial sentence that we're working with is Sylvia has been preparing the report. And we're going to transform that into the sentence after. So as far as Sylvia goes, I am going to use some triangles when the phrase doesn't branch off into anything else. So Sylvia will start there. We'll get T bar. This is going to be a T head. It's minus past because we have the word has. And then we're going to have a perfect phrase branching off into perfect bar with a perfect head, which will be have. And this is has been preparing. Sorry, this shouldn't be have. This should be has in this case. It's a third person singular. So now we have our progressive phrase going into the progressive bar, and that's going to take a progressive, which is the form been, and this will continue. So this might look a little stubborn, but that's okay. And then preparing is going to be our verb phrase for this one, preparing the report specifically. So we'll just continue this tree up here, and then we'll have to put it all together at an appropriate size in order to move some stuff. So Sylvia has been, this is going to be just the verb preparing, and it's going to take a DP complement with a D head, meaning the, and it's going to take a noun phrase complement, which would be report. So if we can put these all together into one tree, we're going to have to downsize things a little bit, which might make it a little bit of a pain to read. But then we can show the whole thing off. Okay, so we have a base generated sentence in deep structure at this point, and now we need to do some movement in order to get the correct word order for our question. So first of all, C is looking to form a question in this case. So this means that has can move up into tense first. So it's going to take minus past and will be has. Then it can move up again into C, where it will land for the question form. So has is going to be eliminated from the perfect, and has is going to be eliminated from the T because it is no longer in those positions. So that's how we can draw a yes-no question. Now, DPs can move too. And why would DPs need to move? Well, we need to consider a locality constraint on theta role assignment. Basically, what this is going to say is that theta roles are assigned within the clause containing the predicate that introduces them. What this means is that theta roles should be assigned very close to the verb. It's not like tense is giving a theta role, like whether it's plus past or minus past. It doesn't care whether it has an agent, an experiencer, or so on. But the verb does. So if we assume now that every single verb phrase consists of at least a voice P, I should really say predicate rather than verb phrase. So it's a voice P with a voice bar going down to voice, and then that's going to select a VP to V bar to V, and that would have potentially a complement after that. What we're going to say is that agents are going to generate under the specifier of voice P, and themes are going to generate under the complement of V. So these are where our determiner phrases are going to start, but that's not going to get us the right word order. So we'll use the EPP, the extended projection principle, in order to move our agents up into the subject position as the specifier of TP. So this is what a typical sentence would look like with a transitive verb. So instead of T bar having the VP immediately after, we will always have a voice phrase that is active or passive. And that voice is going to select a verb phrase. Now, the theme is generated as the complement of the verb, but the agent is going to be the specifier of the voice phrase. So in order to get the correct word order for our sentences, the agent is going to move from its position under the specifier voice P into the specifier of the TP and become the subject. And the reason for that is because the extended projection principle says that every clause must have a subject, and these are where subjects are located in English. So how would a passive differ? If I say the cat was, I need a passive sentence. The cat was eaten. That's the typical verb we're going for here. If we say the cat was eaten, when we think about the role of the cat in here, this is not the one doing the eating. This is the thing that is being eaten. It's the thing being affected by the verb. So this is the theme. So how does the theme end up in the subject position? Well, in these passive sentences, we say that the voice, when it's passive, doesn't allow an agent to generate. So there is nothing in the specifier of voice P that we can move in order to fulfill the subject role. Instead, what we need to do is take the complement of the verb, which is the theme, and we need to move something into spec TP to satisfy the extended projection principle. So the theme is being moved up and becomes the subject. So that's how we can get a sentence like the cat was eaten. So the important thing here is that the active voice will assign an agent role as the specifier of voice P, but the passive voice does not allow it. And because there is no agent to move, we need to move the closest determiner phrase up, and that just so happens to be the theme. So what other reason would we need any sort of movement other than the EPP? Well, English uses case assignment for that. So we have three different types of case that we'll use: nominative, which is given to subjects; accusative, which is given to objects; and prepositional, which is given to indirect objects and just objects of prepositions in general. So prepositional case is kind of loose. It could be dative, locative, a lot of different meanings, but we'll just assume prepositional is prepositions. And case in English only really appears on pronouns. So we know if we say a sentence like I love him, that I and him have to be in certain forms. I is in the nominative case in this sentence, and him is in the accusative case. If we flip these around and we put the accusative case on I to form me, and the nominative case on he or on him to form he, then we get an ungrammatical sentence. And that's because subjects have to be nominative and objects have to be accusative. So what we're going to introduce is the case filter. And we're basically going to say every single DP, every single determiner phrase has to have case. And if there is a determiner phrase that does not have case, then the structure will be ungrammatical. So different heads are going to do things with case a little bit differently. So the T head is what's going to give nominative case or check it. You can think of it not as assigning, but as checking it. The verb is going to check accusative case with its complement, and the preposition, the P, is going to check the prepositional case with its complement as well. So if we see this in action, what this means is that in order for the subject to exist, it must have nominative case, and it must be aligned with the tense head. So the head can check the features of its specifier, essentially. For the verb phrase, this is where accusative case is going to be checked or assigned, depending on how you want to look at it. So the verb will check accusative case with its complement, its direct object. And for prepositions, we'll use prep case, and that will be checking with the DP that comes after the preposition. So these are specific places in our English structures where words have to go in order to get case for the sentence to be grammatical, because every determiner phrase needs case. So what if a determiner phrase can't get case? Well, then we're looking at a case of raising, and it will get case eventually, but let's just take a look at a few sentences first. So it is acknowledged that Steve flew. So we have an expletive here, and then we have that Steve flew coming after it. But like we said before, we can put these that phrases into expletive positions and get that Steve flew is acknowledged. Now, we can't say he is acknowledged that Steve flew, or it is acknowledged Steve to fly, or Steve to fly is acknowledged, but we can say that Steve is acknowledged to fly. Now, if we think about these sentences, they have two verbs. They have two predicates. They have is acknowledged, and then they have fly. Now, let's think about this. For is acknowledged, we can just say it is acknowledged that something happens. So is acknowledged is not assigning an agent in this case. So what is assigning an agent? Well, fly is assigning an agent. That's the one doing the assignment. So flew is going to assign an agent role to Steve, and is acknowledged is going to assign a proposition with certain features to the complementizer phrase, but it, because it has no case, is an expletive here. Now, here's the question. If we take a look at F, we have Steve is acknowledged to fly. So how does Steve end up in the subject position if Steve is the agent of fly? Okay, that's interesting. So we have a more complicated structure here, and basically we're going to have different types of movement, and for different reasons. So I want to take a look first at this lower tense phrase. So this is Steve is acknowledged to fly. So to fly is an infinitive form. So fly will end up under the verb phrase, and to will appear under tense. But this is special because to cannot assign nominative case. It does not allow it. So what's going to happen is Steve will start as an agent next to fly under the voice phrase. It's going to move up to satisfy EPP of the smaller clause because every TP is going to need to have a subject, but it doesn't have case. So this can't be grammatical at this point. So what it needs to do is raise even further to the higher clause where we have a present tense, Steve is acknowledged to fly, and it's going to check case with that TP instead. So because Steve isn't getting or checking nominative case with its infinitive to in the smaller TP, it needs to move up to the higher TP in order to check case. And this is still going to be okay because it's not like Steve is getting two theta roles. Steve still just has one theta role. Steve is still just an agent. So if we remove all these markings, Steve gets its agency from the voice phrase in fly. It moves up for EPP purposes, but doesn't get case, so it's not grammatical yet. So it has to move further up to the top in order to get case, and this is justified by the EPP movement as well. Now, what about passives? Okay, well, passives are going to work the same kind of way. The food was eaten. Well, eaten, in its passive form, does not assign accusative case. It does not check it. This is minus accusative. So it needs to get case. So what's going to happen is the food is going to move up into the specifier of TP for EPP movement and reasons. And then that is going to check case with the nominative head on T. Now, why does this have nominative case when it should be generated as an object or as a direct object of eaten? Well, let's ask ourselves, would we have the pronoun form he or him in this sentence? He was eaten or him was eaten. Well, we would pick he was eaten. This is what would be grammatical. So it should end up with nominative case in the end, even though it starts as a theme. All right, and again, for reiteration from earlier, we do not have an agent because this is passive, so the voice phrase does not allow one to generate. So let's draw a structure for this sentence. Donnie is likely to have been kissed by the puppy. Okay, this one might be a little bit of a doozy. It's a little bit big, but that's okay. So, okay, we have a few things here. Let's just start at the top. So this is going to start as a CP with a C bar and C. This is not a question, so nothing will occupy it. Then we're going to have a tense phrase with T bar and T. It's is likely, so this will be minus past. We should be introducing a voice phrase. However, is likely isn't assigning an agent, so we don't really need a voice phrase in this case. So I'm just going to skip that and do a VP. The verb is, and then we have an adjective phrase, which has an adjective head, likely. Now, this is our beginning part. And what's going to come after? Well, we have is likely to have been kissed by the puppy. So to have been kissed, this is a complementizer phrase. And we'll start the next set over here. We're probably not going to be able to put this into one structure at the very end. So to have been kissed by the puppy. So that's going to be a C bar with a C head. This is also minus Q. This will take a tense phrase. It's going to have a subject at some point, but not right now. So that's going to be T, which is to in this case. It's infinitive. Now, to have been kissed. This is going to be a perfect phrase. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to introduce the bar level because we know what it is, but there should be a bar level there. And it's to have been kissed. So it's not a progressive phrase that comes after have. It instead is the voice phrase. And I won't skimp out on this one because this is been in the past tense or in the participle form. And it's going to take a verb phrase after. And that verb phrase is going to have a V bar. We need to include by the puppy at some point. So I'm going to abbreviate this because otherwise the structure will get a little bit too big. And then we have our verb kissed. Okay, so if we're thinking about where these go, these just follow along into these spots. But I want to remove those arrows because we're going to use arrows for movement. So first of all, Donnie is likely to have been kissed by the puppy. So what we have is a theme here. The theme should be Donnie, because Donnie is the one being kissed. He's not the one initiating the kissing. He is the thing being kissed. So Donnie is going to start as a theme, which means it's going to be a complement of the verb. Now, it doesn't have case yet. So this DP is going to have to move to the specifier of TP, the first TP that it sees, in order to get case. But this is problematic because to does not check nominative case. It does not give it. So Donnie has to keep moving. So Donnie is going to move up to the specifier of TP in the higher TP. And because T checks nominative case, we are now okay. We now have a grammatical sentence. So that one was a little bit more complicated than some of the other trees. They get really big at certain points, but it's just movement for EPP and case purposes, and we figure out where things are generated based on their semantic roles. Moving into the final stretch, let's figure out how to make WH questions and figure out where we cannot make WH questions. So we could form WH questions to ask about determinative phrases, adverb phrases, or prepositional phrases. So for example, if we have the base generated sentence, Martha saw Frank, we can ask questions about Frank, like who did Martha see? So maybe you didn't catch what the sentence was. Maybe you saw Martha, maybe you heard Martha saw, but you didn't catch the word Frank. So you'd say, who did Martha see? Now, we seem to be having some yes-no movement going on because we have did Martha see, and then you could put someone's name after there. And then we also have the thing we're questioning moving even more upfront than did in this case. Or in the case of I went to the store, we could be asking, well, where did you go? So again, to the store is turning to a WH word going up front, but we also see did appearing before the subject as well. So to form a WH question, first we're going to form yes-no question movement. We're going to change whatever phrase we're asking about into a WH word, and then we're going to move that WH word into the specifier of the highest CP. So on the left, we just have the very simple sentence, the declarative sentence, Martha saw Frank. So Frank is going to be the complement of saw because it's the direct object. We have an active voice in the sentence. Martha is being generated as the specifier of the voice phrase to get the agent role. And then it's moving up into the specifier of the tense phrase for EPP. Now, if we want to form a question from this, like who did Martha see, here's the extra steps that are happening. So we have the EPP movement as normal on Martha here. So we can ignore that for now. Because we're forming a yes-no question first, we need to insert an auxiliary like do under T because we don't have any other auxiliaries in order to move. So did is going to move into C because it's forming a plus Q, a question. So did goes up front. And then Frank, which was the object in the old case, we're asking about the object. So we're turning that into a WH word, and then we're moving it into the specifier of the CP. So if we take a look at the structure on our left, the CP specifier position is now being filled with a WH word, and our C node is now getting our tense. So that's the extra little bit of movement that is occurring in WH movement. So we can further account for features on C to figure out which type of sentences or questions we are creating. So for example, with declarative sentences and that clauses, we're going to say it's not a question, but we're also going to specifically say it's not searching for a WH word. So this is not a WH question. If it's a yes-no question, well, it's plus Q because we're asking a question, but again, we're not asking for a WH word. When we do ask for WH words, now C is going to be plus Q and plus WH. Now, with this, we can also account for embedded WH clauses, like I know who you are. That's not a question, but it does have a WH word up front. So we can create this relationship now between C and the specifier, and we can say that it is going to check these WH features. So if we have a WH word in the specifier of the CP, then it needs to be able to check with the head of C to show that these are both plus WH. If we have a case where we have a WH word in the specifier of the CP, but we have the minus WH feature, either this is going to be ungrammatical or this DP in the specifier of CP is going to have to keep moving up. So we can extract WH words out of that clauses no problem. So if we say Mary believed that John kissed Sue, we could ask a question about who Sue was, because maybe we missed that when we were listening to the sentence. And even though we have this inner CP and a larger CP out there for Mary believed, we can still move Sue all the way to the front of the sentence. So in other words, it's skipping a CP. And the reason for that is because this CP on the inside that John kissed is minus WH, but the CP that is the entire sentence is plus WH. So it can get checked at the top. And this type of movement is called cyclic movement. So let's see this in action. And there's a lot of movement going on. So I'm not showing any EPP movement. So who did Mary believe that John kissed? So I'll explain this briefly. Mary is the agent of believe. So it's generating under the voice P, and it would be moving up to the specifier of TP to get nominative case. Now, in terms of the lower clause, so John kissed someone. John is the kisser, so it's generating in the specifier of the voice phrase, and then it's moving up to the specifier of the tense phrase for nominative case as well. But let's not focus on that. Instead, let's focus on the WH movement going on with the object of kissed. So first, it's generating beside kissed as a complement, and then it's moving up into the specifier of the CP, where WH words go, but we have a minus WH feature on that. So that means that who cannot stay in this position under the specifier of the lower CP. So what it's going to do is it's going to keep moving up into the higher CP, where this is now a plus Q plus WH. So the plus WH is being checked with the WH word in the specifier of CP. But we also have some movement in the higher CP as well under tense. So did originates under T, and then it moves up into C because we're forming a question. It's a plus Q feature, so it's pulling T up to C. And then we get the question, who did Mary believe that John kissed? So the other thing to note is that we still have that in the lower complementizer phrase. Again, this is minus Q minus WH, and those are the features we're going to get for that. Now, what about embedded clauses? So when you say, I wonder who left me, there's something interesting here. We cannot continue to move who from this position in the lower CP. So I wonder who left me is fine, but who did I wonder that left me doesn't sound so good. So it would originate beside left, and then it would be moving up. Now, we're not able to continue moving the WH word once it gets its plus WH feature checked. Now, in the case of I wonder who left me, the CP in this case under the C head will be plus WH minus Q. So it's not forming a question, but it is checking the WH word. So we can't continue moving it. So if we were to diagram this, what we see in this case is we're questioning the subject. I wonder who left me. So someone left me. So who is originating as an agent under the voice phrase. It is moving to the specifier of TP for EPP reasons. And then it's going to continue to move up to get its plus WH feature checked. Because even though it has nominative case under the specifier of TP, it does not have its WH feature checked yet. So it has to keep moving. Now at this point, the checking is now complete. So who cannot move any further? Okay. We also have relative clauses, and relative clauses are basically clauses that modify a noun. They're formed from two simple sentences. So for example, I bought a dog and a dog is expensive. We see that there's some overlap with a dog. So we can take our second clause and we can change this, a dog is expensive, to who is expensive. This is the overlapping word. We can change that to a WH word, and then we can insert our second clause immediately after the repeated noun in the first clause. And we would get, I bought a dog who is expensive. So this is an interesting case because we have some co-indexation with the word dog and who. This means that they're referring to exactly the same thing. So how do we account for this in our structures? Well, first of all, we need these to be separate words still. They can't overlap into the same position. So dog, who is expensive. So because this is a complementizer phrase modifying a noun dog, we're going to consider this to be an adjunct. So it's between n bar levels. And in terms of the inner clause, well, we know something is expensive. The dog is expensive. So the dog is an agent generating under the specifier of the voice phrase. It's moving up to the TP in order to get case and for EPP reasons. And then it's going to move up to the specifier of the CP because this is a WH word and it needs to check its features with the C head. And at that point, our derivation is complete. But one thing is important to note, and that is in English, you cannot pronounce both a WH word and that in the same clause. So if we pronounce the word who, then that is going to be unpronounced. So we have a line through it. But it's also perfectly possible to say, I bought a dog that is expensive, in which case who would not be pronounced, but that under C would be pronounced. So this is a crucial point in semantics, which we're not talking about here. But just to note, who and that both exist in relative clauses. It's just that only one of them can be pronounced. Now, there are some cases where we cannot form WH questions. And basically, these are going to be pulling things out of islands. Now, an island syntactically is just a structure that words can't move out of. So, for example, if we have a complex DP, so in other words, the fact that, or the reason that, or the claim that something, we cannot pull words out of the that clause and form a question from them. So, for example, 78a, who did Lori state the fact that will prevent forest fires? That is not a grammatical sentence, and that is because we're pulling the subject, WH word, out of a complex DP. But if we just have this as a regular object, so who did Lori state that will prevent forest fires, this is totally fine. This is just the verb, and this is its CP complement, so we can pull the WH word out. We also can't move words out of WH islands, so these are these embedded WH clauses. So for who do you wonder what bought? That is ungrammatical. We already have movement from the subject to be what in this case. So we have something filling the specifier CP position, which means that we're not going to be able to take another word and move it into that same position and keep moving it out. So in other words, the spec CP is already occupied by the subject in this case, so we can't form a question with the object. What do you know whoever made? That, again, doesn't make sense either. We already have a WH word filling the specifier of the CP, so this is unable to move to that position to further escape outward. So let's try to draw a tree structure for this sentence. What did you buy at the supermarket? And we have to consider the base generated sentence in order to do movement. So it would be, you bought something at the supermarket. And what we're doing in this case is we're turning something into a WH word what, and we're moving it out front. And we're also going to have to introduce an auxiliary in order to get did out there as well. So for this sentence, we'll start with a CP. We're going to have a spot for what to go. But we have a C head, and this is going to be a question. It's also going to be plus a WH. And then the rest will just generate as normal. So this is a tense phrase with a DP subject, which is going to be you. This is going to branch out into a T bar with T, which is going to get did at some point because we're going to have to do insertion in order to form the question. And this did is going to move up into our C position. Now, the tense is going to select a voice phrase as its complement because we need to generate the subject in this case. So what is the subject? The subject is you, in other words, the agent. So this is going to move from the voice phrase up into the specifier of TP, where we already have you. Now we need to break this up into a voice bar and a voice head, which is active, so we're not going to pronounce anything there. And then for our verb phrase, we're having the word buy. So we're going to buy something, but at the supermarket, which means at the supermarket is going to be an adjunct. So we'll just abbreviate that with a prepositional phrase with a triangle under it. So at the supermarket. And then we have the verb buy, but we should make sure it's in the proper position. So we have buy down here. Now it's also too important to remember that what did you buy at the supermarket? You bought something. So the WH word is coming as the object. So this is going to be a complement to the verb. It's going to be a sister to the verb in this case. So our determiner phrase is going to be what, originating as the complement of buy. Now this is going to move up into the specifier of the CP because we have a WH feature under C that needs to check with its specifier. So in terms of our final pronunciations, we're not pronouncing the U under the voice P, we're not pronouncing the what as a complement of the verb, and we're not pronouncing did in its original tense position, so we're going to get the sentence now, what did you buy at the supermarket, in its final form. Now, to finish this video and course, we're going to briefly talk about ditransitives and then raising and control verbs. So ditransitives have two forms. You can say either I sent a book to you or I sent you a book. And there's going to be slightly different analyses depending on which form we take. So for I sent a book to you, we're going to do a little bit of revision on our VP where our theme generates. The agent is still going to generate under the voice phrase, but the theme is now going to be the specifier of the the specifier of the VP, and the goal is going to be the complement. So in our final structure, I sent a book to you. A book would be our theme, to you would be our goal, and then I would be our agent. So after movement into the specifier of TP, we're going to get a nice correct word order. Now, if we do the double object construction, so I sent you a book, we're going to need a lot more phrases and positions to do thematic role introduction as well as case checking. So we're going to need our voice phrase to start the chain, then we're going to need an agreement phrase. So AGR just stands for agreement. We have one for indirect objects, one for regular objects, and then we're going to have an applicative phrase in between agreement IO and agreement O in order to do goal generation. So there's a little list down at the bottom. Each of these are going to be places where the verbs move to. So there's going to be lots of verb movement for checking, but the voice P is going to introduce agents. The agreement indirect object phrase is going to do dative case checking, so on to. The applicative phrase is going to introduce the goal. The agreement object phrase will do accusative case checking, and the verb phrase is going to introduce our theme. So what this is going to look like is the structure on the right. Now, first, I want to point out in our structure, we have voice P at the top, then A or IO, applicative, ag or O, and then the verb phrase. Now, the verb is being moved up to the head of each of these respective phrases. And that's because the verb is going to move to a position, do some checking or assignment, and then keep going forward. And it's going to be pronounced at the highest level, or I sent you a book. Now, I'll get rid of those arrows so we can look at everything else in this diagram. First, the theme, a book, is generating as the specifier of the verb phrase now, and it's moving into the specifier of the ag or O phrase for accusative case. Then the goal is going to be generating under the specifier of the applicative phrase here, and it's going to be moving up into the specifier of the agreement IO phrase, so that way it can check its case with the dative, because this is an indirect object. And then our agent, as usual, is going to start in the specifier of the voice P, and it will then move up into the specifier of the TP for EPP movement. Now, the voice is active in this sentence, so we can still generate an agent, and we can also have the verb end up under the voice head. But if this were a passive voice, we wouldn't be able to move anything up into voice in the end. So we would have to say was sent, and sent, the verb, will not end up in voice. It will stop a little bit earlier under Egger IO. Now, the last topic is raising and control verbs. So there are some sentences where it looks like a DP is going to get two theta roles, and that's a little bit of a problem. So in the case of Trevor wants to leave, want needs an agent. But then again, so does leave. Because if we think about Trevor wants to leave, Trevor is doing the wanting, but Trevor is also doing the leaving. And that would mean that Trevor gets two theta roles, and we don't want that. But if we compare it with Trevor is likely to leave, is likely doesn't take an agent. It doesn't have any role for its subject, but Trevor is definitely the leaver. So what we call 82A, where Trevor gets two thematic roles, these are going to be control verbs, and ones where Trevor only gets one role, these are going to be raising verbs. So we can think of it as Trevor is raising out from the inner CP, while in 82A, actually Trevor isn't going to start in the lower CP to get its agent role. It's actually going to start in the higher CP, and we're going to introduce something in this position in the lower CP to get an agent role, because we do not want a single DP to get more than one thematic role. So what we use is what's called Big Pro. And Big Pro is co-indexed with the determiner phrase that it refers to. So when Trevor wants to leave, Trevor and the big pronoun are referring to the same thing, which is Trevor. But Pro is special. Pro is not pronounced. So what this means is that when we actually speak our sentences, that there's nothing being spoken there. But Pro is going to be an agent, and Trevor is going to be an agent too. So this is a way that we can have just one determiner phrase getting one role. The other thing is that to leave is an infinitive phrase. So it's not going to be able to check nominative case with its DP subject, which is the pro. So Big Pro is also caseless. It does not have case. So it's caseless. It does not have a pronunciation, but it does receive a thematic role. Now, in the case of raising verbs, well, in Trevor to leave, it is the agent of to leave. It doesn't get nominative case, so it's going to have to move up to the higher CP to check that. Now, again, this is fine because is likely is only selecting a CP. It's not assigning another agent role to Trevor because it's not giving an agent role at all. So here's how these two structures work. On the left, we have our control case. So this is Trevor wants to leave. So the agent of to leave is Big Pro. It's being generated under the voice phrase. And then it is moving to the specifier of the TP for EPP purposes, because every clause needs a subject. Now it's going to stop here because it doesn't need case. It's just moving for EPP purposes, and it already has a thematic role. So that movement is done. Then Trevor is going to be the agent of wants, so it's going to generate under voice P in the higher CP, and then it's going to move to the specifier of TP for EPP purposes, and also to check nominative case with T. So we say this is a control verb because Trevor, the referent, is controlling what the Big Pro refers to. Now, in the case of is likely, we did see this a little bit earlier, but just for the contrast, Trevor is the agent of to leave. It's being moved to spec TP for EPP purposes, but the infinitive does not have nominative case. This is a pronounced word, so Trevor must continue to move up the structure to the higher TP in order to check nominative case on the minus past head. All right, so that was it as far as an undergraduate course in syntax. Some of these may have been a little fast, so I encourage you to purchase the Carney textbook for more detailed information as well as a lot of practice questions. But I hope this video was either a really good introduction or a good review of things if you're studying for exams. This covers pretty much all of the important parts that would have been taught in a course, except for maybe binding theory and maybe some optional content. Now, there's some things I do want to point out because we've gotten to the end of this video. You might not use voice P in your class. So in some cases, the VP and the V bar and the V, you can do everything we've done by assuming the agent generates under the specifier of the VP and the theme generates as its complement. So we can still do an analysis like this. You might also use a little VP instead of voice P. These are called verb shells. They also account for causative constructions. And there's a paper by Larson in 1988 that goes over this in more detail. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this long video.